Good morning. Today is Tuesday, January 14th, 2020. It's 9:30 and it's the regularly scheduled meeting of the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Good morning. Let the record reflect that Commissioners Decker, Goldsmith, Soboroff, Bonner are present and we have a quorum.
Very well, thank you. Commissioners, fellow commissioners, I realize we have an agenda in front of us, but unless there's an objection, because this is the first meeting of the year, which, by the way, we should say Happy New Year to everyone, and it's been a few weeks since we have met due to the holidays. Much has happened, and I'd like to ask the chief to give his report and go first. That's not to diminish the significance of the other items on the agenda, but there's a lot for, in my opinion, the chief to report on, including crime stats for the years, recruitment efforts, the investigation involving the field investigation cards in Metropolitan Division, the RIPA report, and other issues that have happened since our last meeting, but also the traditional year-end information. So unless there's an objection, I'm going to ask the chief to proceed with his report.
Great.
With that, Chief.
Good morning and Happy New Year to everyone. So I'm going to, as requested, move this up and cover significant events, and it is going to be a bit in varying subjects. I'll outline it. I'll begin with the categorical uses of force that I do each week that's occurred during this period of time. I'm going to talk briefly about some published reports relative to e-SCARs and our investigations of those matters. We'll get to a briefing, very high-level briefing on a personnel investigation, a significant one involving Metropolitan Division and the accuracy of information that officers within that command completed. RIPA, which is a report that was issued recently regarding the Racial Identity Profiling Act that involves the department, and as you indicated, a briefing as year-end crime and traffic stats, and then lastly, our recruitment. Before I begin though, I would ask for your indulgence. This past Sunday, the City of Los Angeles and the county lost one of its protectors, and that is a sheriff deputy by the name of Amber Less, who was off duty at the time of her death.
Excuse me, Chief. Mr. Herman, I believe that was you. Should you disrupt this meeting again with an outburst of that nature, you will be excused from this meeting. Chief?
The events on Sunday have been published reports. It is a current LAPD traffic investigation where Ms. Lest was in her own private vehicle and found two women that were in distress and attempted to render aid and escort them across a busy intersection. And as she accomplished that and returned to her vehicle, unfortunately she was struck and killed by another motorist. The loss of her is not just an injury and loss to the Sheriff's Department, but to all of Los Angeles, and then I would ask for a moment of silence in recognition of her sacrifice. Thank you very much. There is a vigil tonight that is going to be held in honor of her service and dedication at the site, which is Whitsett and Riverside at 7 o'clock. Moving to the categorical uses of force that occurred during this period of time, there were three. The first one involving a law enforcement-related injury that occurred in North Hollywood Division on January 5th of 2020. North Hollywood officers responded to a radio call of a vandalism suspect at the 6200 block of North Hollywood, and the individual was later identified as Octawayne Balankowski, and forgive me on the pronunciation, and he was reportedly possibly under the influence of an unknown substance and was throwing rocks at the residents there. When the officers arrived, they located him in the front yard and attempted to communicate with him. Mr. Balankowski then climbed a fence into a neighboring yard which was later learned to his parents, and entered that residence. Once inside, he began yelling and grabbed his mother, allegedly with both arms. In an effort to detain him, the officers requested a backup, and subsequently in their encounter with him, a use of force occurred. involving the application of a firm grip and body weight. Mr. Balankowski was ultimately transported by a rescue ambulance to Sherman Oaks Hospital due to his apparent drug intoxication, and on the following day it was determined that his right elbow had been dislocated during the use of force, and he was admitted for that injury. As a result of his being admitted, and on that injury as resulting from an application of a use of force by officers, it became a categorical use of force, and Force Investigations Division responded, and they'll be handling the administrative investigation. Mr. Belankowski was not charged with any account or crime at this point, pending further investigation. The Officer Inspector General was advised of this incident. Second incident is an officer-involved shooting that occurred on January 5th, a few hours prior to this other incident. This shooting involved no hits, meaning that the individual, the officers who shot at, was not struck by gunfire. In this instance, Northeast Patrol officers observed an individual later identified as Julio Rodriguez, a male Hispanic, 22 years of age, in the area of Griffith and Avenue 43. The officers conducted a narcotic investigation stop, resulting in Mr. Rodriguez fleeing on foot. The investigation escalated into a foot pursuit of Mr. Rodriguez, who was suspected of being armed. At the 4400 block of Griffith, Mr. Rodriguez allegedly pointed a firearm, which resulted in an officer-involved shooting. Mr. Rodriguez was not struck and was taken into custody without further incident. No officers were injured. A loaded 9mm handgun was recovered at the scene. Force Investigation Division responded. They'll be handling the administrative investigation. Mr. Rodriguez was charged with assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer, and the DA's office, officer-involved shooting team, did not respond. The Officer of the Inspector General did to the scene. The last event categorical occurred at the border between LAPD's Pacific area and Culver City. The actual shooting itself occurred in the city of Culver City. This occurred on the 11th of January at approximately 12:45 hours, and on that date, a radio call was generated regarding a man with a gun in the area of South Sepulveda Boulevard and South Venice Boulevard. That intersection acts as a border between Pacific area and the city of Culver City. A field supervisor assigned to Pacific Patrol was in the area and responded east on South Venice Boulevard towards the location. Upon the arrival, the supervisor observed the individual, later identified as Victor Valencia, a male Hispanic, 31 years of age, observed him pointing what the supervisor believed to be a handgun towards the supervisor, resulting in an officer-involved shooting. Mr. Valencia was struck by an unknown number of rounds. He was taken into custody and treated at the scene by LA City firefighter paramedics and transported to a nearby hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. A bicycle part with a physical makeup very similar to a handgun was located at the scene. There were no officers injured during this incident. Force Investigation Division responded, as did the District Attorney's Officer-Involved Shooting Rollout Team and the Inspector General. At the time of this report, at the initial time, Mr. Valencia's identity was not known. It was later learned through our communication with the City of Culver City that he was known to them as an individual who frequented their area, and with their assistance and also the county, LA County Coroner's Office, he was identified, and a sister, I believe, was notified of his passing. The Family Liaison Unit is available and will support the family in any further needs as far as this investigation as it progresses. The next area I want to cover is there was a couple of reports last couple of weeks relative to eSCARS. eSCARS stands for the Electronic Suspected Child Abuse Report, and there was a report that the department had some nearly 4,000 of these investigations that during an 18-month period were not investigated, which raised public concerns relative to whether the department was diligent and acting responsibly in the sense of its obligations to investigate suspected child abuse reports. I want to clarify that for you, the information, because the reports, the public's reports were in error significantly. And I also want to correct the record as to what we know today, and also alert the commission that it is my intention to have a written report to you next Tuesday at the next commission meeting that will detail this further and also avail the commission to a written report of this account. Basically, during the January 18th to June 19th period, there was some 36,000 suspected child abuse reports that came to the department's attention. Suspected child abuse reports are accounts that identify potential for or a need for an investigative response by one of many agencies. We have a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Children and Family Services that define the type of investigations of suspected child abuse reports that we respond to and the types that are the responsibility of the Department of Children and Family Services. In this instance, there was an earlier report before a commission, a children's commission, that some 4,000 were classified by us as no investigation, and there was the implication or assertion that those should have been investigated by LAPD. That immediately caused concern on my part, and we initiated an investigation into a physical review of each of those 3,987 reports. That has been completed by Juvenile Division, and what this has identified is that these cases were the classification of the system, which only allows certain labels or classifications, mischaracterized what our involvement with that case was. What should have been said is, rather than no investigation, is no investigation by no law enforcement investigation, that these are cases that are responsibility by agreement with the Department of Children and Family Services. These cases in our review were non-criminal emotional abuse issues, the criteria that fits the memorandum of agreement, that of the 36,000, this portion, 3,987, are the responsibilities of the Department of Children and Family Services. The eSCAR system has, in its classification, no investigation, which misleads one to believe that there was no investigation. But in our review or investigation of the circumstances, we determined that, in fact, it does not meet our criteria. There was, in 302 cases, there was an error on our part because we did complete an injury report or an investigative report that found no crime and should have at least indicated that. Training has been given on those errors, on that 302 cases of the initial 3,900 to inform our juvenile officers as to what should have happened in those instances. Secondly, we're working with Department of Children and Family Services and the LA County District Attorney's Office to improve the system with a recommendation that we add the classification of no law enforcement investigation, because it's not our responsibility by agreement, versus the current characterization, because I do think for the public and others on first glance it's misleading. However, this opportunity for us has allowed us to look more deeply into what the facts and circumstances of our review of eSCARs, and what we implemented in the interim was an improvement to the system. The first improvement was we're shortening the period of time in which a reported electronic suspected child abuse report comes to the department's attention is to be investigated and reviewed and completed. Previously, that was a 30-day period of time. We've now moved that to 10 days. And I believe that that's more reflective of the fact that these are suspected child abuse reports and deserve a quicker and faster resolution as to an understanding of when they merit law enforcement involvement in investigation and pursuit, and also the welfare of the involved child. Secondly, we have been in discussion, and I believe this has served as an opportunity for us to work further with Department of Children and Family Services in our open invitation for them to co-locate with us. I think this is an opportunity there was some miscommunication here about an understanding of what we're doing with these that I think improves by co-locating Department of Children and Family Services investigators with the department. Currently, that invitation stands, and it's in the first quarter of this 2020, I look for us to co-locate with those resources, their own personnel alongside us in Detective Squad Bays in the Mission area and 77th area. Those are the two commands within this department that have the highest number of suspected child abuse reports in the city. As I said, we will present a written report on these findings I believe that for the public, it was important for me today, in advance of that written report, to clarify that what our responsibilities were in this instance and what our investigation found relative to the actions of our personnel. Next area I want to get into is one that has troubled me, and I made a public media release last week, and in the absence of a commission meeting, did not have an opportunity to talk about this with this entire commission. And that is an investigation that began last year involving Metropolitan officers. In early 2019, in the San Fernando Valley, a mother of a young man, a male Hispanic, received written correspondence from the department informing her that her son had been identified as a gang member. She believed her son was mistakenly identified, and so she responded to the Van Nuys station and met with the supervisor there to challenge that assertion. That correspondence is part of the requirements within the gang database, an intelligence database that gathers information and stores it across the state on individuals who who on the basis of fitting identified criteria are placed there as an investigative resource for law enforcement in its efforts to solve gang crime and gang violence. So she responded to that correspondence, and a supervisor immediately reviewed the circumstances, including body-worn video and other information, and found inconsistencies in the documentation completed by the officers. The parent was notified that she would not be identified that her son would not be identified as a gang member, and any references to him was removed from that stop. The department also initiated a personnel investigation. This was brought to my attention, involving the actions of the 3 officers that were involved in an earlier detention of this young man. Over the course of several months, that investigation has continued and has actually expanded. And as it moved from that initial stop, we caused for the investigation to include other stops and interactions of these 3 involved officers, and the investigation has now identified, I believe, additional inaccuracies based on the preliminary briefing that I have about the information known today. This is still very much an active investigation. I have not passed judgment on any of the involved officers, and I will wait for the full investigation to make that decision. But I am giving you a briefing based on the information I have now.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Please do not shut out during the meeting, or you will be excused as well. Chief?
Over the course of the several months, we looked at not just those initial investigations of those steps of those officers, but then any other officers that worked with those officers, and then officers who worked with that second set of officers. So I have expanded this investigation to include as many officers who initially touched those 3 officers in their day-to-day activities. And the purpose of that was to understand the depth and breadth of this, and whether this was isolated and located into few individuals, or it occurred as more frequently or by others. That determination is still ongoing. However, in the course of conducting these investigations, we have now assigned to home 10 involved individuals based on the information that I have at my hand by Professional Standards Bureau, and their briefing of me of the details. I believe that there's sufficient cause that at this point to suspend, or not suspend them, I don't have the power to do that, but to assign them to home and relieve them of place them in an active status as to their peace officer powers. And I've assigned an additional 10 officers that are in a non-field capacity, or approximately that many. And what that means is that there's information that, absent us having conversations and interviewing and conducting further investigations, it's unclear to me whether or not there's inaccuracies or falsehoods, and to the extent that rather than taking the more aggressive tone of assigning them home, I'm placing them, frankly, in a no-field contact. This investigation, as it's grown in the sense of understanding the depth of this problem, now has approximately 24 of our personnel assigned. My intention with the assigning that number of personnel is to move efficiently and effectively through the contacts of the involved officers and to determine the depth of this. We have found through the investigation to this point countless times in which the accuracy of
the body-worn video and the evidence supports the accuracy of the information written on a field interview card. So we have found instances in which officers' conducts were appropriate. But we've also found inaccuracies that and when in some instances we believe are in direct contrast to the physical evidence, and B, in a number of instances, it's unclear and further investigation is required, including interviews with the officers. Next, as far as the seriousness of this, we've also met with the Officer Inspector General for his officer's involvement to ensure that as an independent arm to this commission, that our investigation is fair, that it's unbiased, and that it's complete. Secondly, we are continuing our meetings with the Office of the District Attorney because there are criminal aspects of the conduct of the involved officers for their assessment. I will not pass judgment, as I said, but at this point, this does draw significant concerns to me, given the history of this department and the ghosts and the criticisms of our actions in the past. I believe the vast majority of the men and women of Metropolitan Division are reflective of the actions of this department, which are professionals of the highest standard and moral character. However, I must look straight ahead at these allegations and judge them with a clear a clear eye. And I want to bring this to your attention because it does give me concern, and these are the actions being taken.
Chief, I have one question. I think it's appropriate and not going beyond what we can ask. Will your investigations, and I'm sure the district attorneys, include the possible motivations? In other words,
Yes.
Why would somebody do this? What was their positive reinforcement?
Yes, sir. Obviously, that's why an officer would feel that this would be acceptable is going to be part
Is
of
there
our
a quota
investigation.
system here, or is it things like that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
The next matter I want to move into, and certainly I'm open to any conversation, questions, direction by the commission. I would like to move into the next matter, which is a report by the Racial Identity Profiling Board, its annual report for 2020. This past week, I reviewed their report, which published and analyzed stop data. This is information relative to detentions and consensual encounters involving officers across eight different law enforcement agencies. And in the RIPA Act of 2015, it basically instructed that each police agency across California would record perceived gender, ethnicity, characteristics of individuals they stop, detain, or search. In addition to that, they would we would identify the purpose, underlying essence of how we had that stop, detention, or search, what on the basis of what those encounters, how they occurred, and lastly, what were the outcomes. In the Act, recognizing the number of agencies across the state of California and recognizing the complexities of actually achieving this, it afforded time for agencies to enter into this program. The 8 largest agencies, including Los Angeles, LAPD, LA Sheriff's Department, San Bernardino, San Diego, I said that already, San Francisco, these agencies, we were the first wave. And the first wave involved beginning July of 2018 and a 6-month snapshot. What this report came out was the first report of actually publicizing what that stop data and the characteristics of it were, and as well as its assessment of a number of other areas of department operations. Because the report didn't separate the stop data by department, it's impossible to tell how LAPD compared to the other large police agencies and sheriff's agencies relative to stops, searches, recovery of contraband, citations, and arrests. I do want to compliment the board because I believe that their report analyzed stops using a variety of methodologies and recognized that the limitations of each of those methodologies did not prove or disprove anything, but did raise important questions. I believe the analysis of variety of disparities that required further insight and further review to understand what's influencing the numbers that we're seeing. The board also examined the policies and procedures relative to the 8 large agencies and then came up with a matrix, if you will, and details about what each of those agencies, how they performed. And I'm proud of the work of LAPD. For instance, the report indicates that our complaint process is consistent with best practices. We provide personnel complaint information pamphlets, display it next to the complaint forms. We have a standalone policy prohibiting bias policing and make it available on our website, as well as we provided the RIPA board with a 10-page police and training and education document that talks about our strategies to reduce profiling and racial bias. The department was also identified as taking far more complaints for profiling than any other department in the state. In 2018, it listed us as taking 274 complaints. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department was the next highest and took 67. I believe this is a result, as identified in the report, of our openness. The fact that we do not require people to sign an acknowledgement of a state law of the consequences of a false allegation, that we take anonymous complaints from any source. These are things, this is, I believe, an openness that promotes people to step forward with their concerns about being racially profiled or their actions taken against them based on bias. Moving forward, I've asked our newly appointed director, Liz Rhodes, of the Office of Constitutional Policing and Policing, who chairs our internal RIPA steering committee, comprised of members of the City Attorney's Office, the California Policy Lab, the Office of the Inspector General, representatives from our three offices of Office of Operations, Office of Special Operations, and our technology people. I want them to review this report and discuss strategies as to analyze our own stop data. That's been an ongoing conversation, but I look forward to our department to analyze our data using some of the same methodologies that were used by this report. I believe that in comparing outcomes, I'm confident that our process of introspection will further drive accountability, fairness, and effectiveness. As noted in the RIPA report, we're in the process of developing a stop data dashboard that's intended to provide area commanding officers at a local level with insight into the types of stops being conducted, the reasons, and the outcomes for their individual commands, to see the variations that can occur across the city. We've invited professors from UC Irvine and the California Policy Lab to study the data, and our intention is to invite key community stakeholders to participate in the steering committee's work. Constitutional policing is and will always be an enduring commitment by the LAPD. And just as we continually evaluate our strategies and tactics to ensure they're in the best interest of building trust and making communities safer, so too will remain vigilant that our policy training and protocols ensure that our officers' every actions are oriented towards policing in a fair and impartial manner. To that end, I want to comment that in this last year and a half, I've spent hours with community meetings, particularly in South Los Angeles, but in other parts of the city. And many neighborhoods comprised of Black and Hispanic community members have echoed a concern that while they're desirous of having officers work in their neighborhoods, what's critical is the officers' actions acknowledge the vast majority of residents are law-abiding and should be treated with respect. The essence of this report is that disconnect that can occur between the actions of police in neighborhoods to provide safety and the disparate impact it can have on communities of color. I've heard that clearly, and in keeping communities safe that are impacted by gang and gun violence, it's our top priority, but we have to ensure that we strive to do this in a way that doesn't create distrust and animosity or fear of the police. To that end, I want to recognize that in recognizing the high frequency of vehicle and pedestrian stops that are occurring in these neighborhoods by the expansion of Metropolitan Division that occurred some 5 years ago, and most recently, the relatively low rate of return in relationship to identifying those responsible for violence in those neighborhoods, that we've reorganized Metropolitan Division, reducing their vehicle and pedestrian stops while recognizing their efforts as investigative teams on serious crimes and their need to work with local detectives to arrest named suspects. This is a direct reaction in hearing from communities and also looking at this data and understanding that what is the manner that builds trust versus the efficiency of what others would argue are productive by their gauge. So lastly, in expanding our accountability for our metropolitan and gang details, we are now conducting ongoing reviews of body-worn video stops and detentions. Just as we are investigating Metropolitan Division, we're now doing randomized inspections of gang and other Metropolitan Division stops and detentions to ensure that their actions are consistent with our high standards and are not
that we don't see instances of failure for people to provide the respectful and needed level of service and act in a manner consistent with the Los Angeles police officers' expectations. I recognize there can be questions about this. I want to move next to the crime statistics. And forgive me on my indulgence, these are involved subjects, and so they're not convenient for brief remarks. Regarding crime, I am extremely proud of the work of not just LAPD, but our shared responsibility of public safety in Los Angeles for the results that were achieved in 2019. 2019, we ended with an overall reduction for the second year in a row of Part 1 crimes. These are the crimes that are sorted by the Uniform Crime Reporting Act that deals with violent and property crimes. That 7% reduction represents 9,172 fewer crimes, of which 1,649 were violent crimes, 7,493 were property crimes. What contributed to those crime reductions was a reduction in gang crime, a reduction in the numbers of victims that sustained gunshot wounds. 3% fewer gang crimes, which was 100 fewer gang crimes for the year, and 65 fewer victims shot. The 65 fewer victim shots resulted in us experiencing the lowest number of victims shot by gunfire in more than 22 years. The reduction in this resulted in 253 homicides versus 259 the year before. Not just the 10th year in a row of fewer than 300 homicides, but the lowest number of homicides, pure number, since the mid-60s, and per capita during my existence on this planet, since the early 60s, 1960 to be exact. In there, I believe that the efforts with gang reduction youth development and their intervention and prevention efforts, their outreach during instances of shooting violence, their visits in interdicting growing or expanding violence that we saw earlier this year in the February, March, April of 2019, I think proved highly successful in working with those communities to lessen the impact of violence. Going forward for 2020, an area of concern for us is that while homeless victims and suspects represent less than 5% of all reported crime, it is an area that we have seen an increased victimization of people who are experiencing homelessness. And that number, it was approximately 740 additional individuals this year in 2019 versus 2018 that experienced a crime, of being a victim of crime. Primarily those are aggravated assaults and some robberies. Our work in operations across all of our commands will be while we recognize that is a very small percentage of our overall crime, the vast majority of violence, shooting violence, for instance, in Los Angeles remains gang-related. We nonetheless think that it's an area that as we do our outreach and our services, that we also protect those victims by identifying them and trying to get additional resources to protect them, but also identify those that are preying upon them and remove them from the field. On traffic, we talk each week about that. For the year, overall traffic collisions were down by 700 fewer traffic collisions. That was 4 fewer traffic fatalities this year than last, which is a 3-year trend of a downward decrease, a reduction in fatals from our high of 261 in 2016. So we're seeing success there. However, when you look at traffic fatalities in a longer time frame, we see an increase from our 2015 numbers of 56 more fatals. The majority of those are pedestrian fatals. And that really speaks to where in 2020 we need to move. Fatalities involving pedestrians and fatalities involving hit and runs, which are primarily involving pedestrians, are up, particularly in South Los Angeles. And so it is going to be our work, both of public awareness. I had a press conference with the leadership from our traffic bureau to talk about defensive driving, defensive walking, the importance of not making a hit and run an accident, a crime, by leaving the scene. But there also is an enforcement arm here. While the department's efforts in increasing its enforcement on speed saw a substantial increase in the number of traffic citations. I'm committed to ensuring that South Los Angeles has the investigative resources necessary to investigate and solve particularly hit and runs involving fatalities of pedestrians. Many times, other parts of the city, other locations are experiencing higher levels of clearances of identifying those responsible. So I'm troubled that the highest number of fatal hit and runs occur in South Los Angeles and the lowest number are solved there. And I believe that I want to make sure that we have the right investigative resources there, but I'm also challenging our faith and community leaders to help us identify those that are responsible for this, and also educate communities that in many instances there may be involved pedestrian deaths in these hit and runs where the pedestrian themselves was at fault. They're in a darkened, unmarked street. Their actions unfortunately contributed to the circumstances of that collision, but by the motorists leaving that location, they are then committing a crime, which is something that we've got to stop and see that change. And part of that is, so it's not just an enforcement action here. I believe that our responsibilities include an education and affording the community a knowledge about the consequences of their actions need not be compounded by them leaving a scene. Lastly, commitment to you with my appointment was for us to improve our recruitment, particularly in our areas of diversity. And I want to report on the first full year of my tenure, but also I want to compliment the leadership of Chief Gramala, of Chief Baeza and his team and her team, working with the personnel department in the outreach and engagement to improve our African American, our Asian Pacific Islander, and our recruitment of women on this department in our sworn positions. As a brief snapshot, this last year for recruitment of females or women on the department, we're now averaging 143 candidates each month, which is essentially flat, but 23% of our appointments in the calendar year 2019 were women. I know that the Commission's goal, and my goal, is to attain a level of 50% of academy classes being comprised of women. This number is not there, but it's heading in, I believe, the right direction. We also, in an effort to achieve this, have looked at our recruiters, who are actually people going out, because we're in the business of hiring people, and how are we going out soliciting, identifying, and encouraging capable and qualified women to become members of this organization. And part of that's been increasing and changing the mix of who we have as recruiters. Additionally, we're working on areas that are challenging women in the academy performance, particularly upper body strength and their performance in firearms. And we're initiating some innovative steps to provide additional mentoring and development of those capabilities prior to coming in the academy and also while in the academy, so that when we find qualified and capable individuals, we're not dequalifying them because of the rigors of a system. They need to meet the requirements, but I believe also that there are some cultural issues here that may be impacting their ability to in the time frame that's being provided. Regarding African Americans, our goal is to hire 20% of our recruits as African Americans. Currently, we're testing 84 candidates each month. That's a 47% increase from the previous period. Just over nearly 13% of our appointments in the calendar year 2019 were African American candidates. We, in our goals to reach this, as you know, sought out additional funding for recruitment, ads, marketing, but we've also done outreach to historic black colleges and universities where we identified 64 candidates just this last 6 months. Lastly, before I get to the more overarching issues here, on Asian Pacific Islanders, we're now testing 53 Asian Pacific Islander candidates each month. That's an 18% increase from the previous period. 11% of our appointments in this calendar year versus last were APIs. Our outreach there is obviously attending to areas that have cultural events that can acquaint the community to the fact that we're desirous of bringing them onto this department, and we need them as being a member of this department. Our marketing fund, last issue, our marketing fund this year, we were set aside with $1.3 million between a public-private partnership of funding, and I'm proud of the work, again, of the Officer of Support Services, working with the Personnel Department to come up with a defined and articulated marketing plan for each of these 3 communities. The critical aspect of that is this city made a terrible misstep 6 months ago, resulting in an undermining of the public's trust because we inadvertently ended up on a web page that involved unnecessary controversy and brought us into unnecessary controversy. And so the thoughtful plan of this team in identifying marketing efforts and entities that can promote the core values of this organization without unnecessarily bringing us into controversy and attract viable candidates. It took some time to make that happen, and I'm proud that starting this month, we'll actually start seeing those funds actually go into the actual delivery of those marketing outreach. Again, I appreciate your indulgence on this extended report, and I'm happy to answer your questions or take comments.
Thank you, Chief. You covered a lot of ground there, and I'm sure my fellow commissioners have questions or comments that they wish to make, and I don't want to minimize any of the issues that you covered by not addressing it, but I'd like to focus on 2 things. First, on recruitment. I'd like to see in the near future a more detailed evaluation of the recruitment process. Excuse me, maybe that should be the hiring process. I understand you reported on the number of targeted groups that are entering the process, but I'd like to see where they're falling off in the hiring process so that we can identify potential problems and perhaps get to the root core of some of the issues why they're not making it through the process at the level that we would like to see. Secondly, I'd like to address the investigation being conducted by the department and by the district attorney's office involving the allegations of falsified field investigation cards that were submitted by officers assigned to Metropolitan Division that may have led to individuals being improperly added to CalGangs. These allegations are extraordinarily troubling, and I say that also in the context of the recently released Racial Identity and Profiling Act report issued by the state about 10 days ago. So in light of that, I'd like to make a motion that I'd like to hear from my colleagues about if you have any comments, and of course public comment, and so we would vote on it after hearing all public comment. And it's in 2 parts. First, that the Inspector General continue to monitor the investigation to ensure its thoroughness and completeness. In addition, that all avenues of investigation are being pursued, especially determine whether the actions involved, assuming true, of course, are the actions of one or a small group of people or is far more pervasive. In other words, we'd like to get a handle on the depth of the problem. Secondly, with respect to the RIPA data, I'd ask the IG to conduct a review. And I'm aware that the state report that was just issued a few days ago is actually related to the first 6 months of the program, which is from the latter part of 2018. So I'd ask the IG to look at the 2019 data in particular, not to ignore the state report. In fact, review those findings that were made in the state report and what action should be taken. But I'd like a more current analysis of what we are seeing in the data being maintained by the department. Review that data as to all divisions that are engaged in stop activity, including Metropolitan Division, so that we can see an analysis of that. And Mr. Inspector General, I'd like you to report back to us on the progress you are making and when we can expect a report within 90 days. Is that reasonable, sir? I realize the amount of data is great, and to evaluate it can take time, but I'd like to have an assessment of where you stand on this investigation sooner if possible. But as I understand the amount of data, it's great, and I want to be sure we actually get a thorough analysis. Is that reasonable, sir?
Yes, Commissioner, I think it's absolutely reasonable, particularly for a status update within 90 days, which we will do. And just one other note I wanted to mention with regard to the ongoing investigation that's been discussed by you and by the chief. As I think you may be aware, the Inspector General's office has been very actively monitoring the investigation for some time now, including regular and frequent updates from Internal Affairs Group with regard to their activities so far. We'll continue doing so.
I understand that. I'm asking you to do, in fact, a deeper dive.
Yes.
And your own independent review. So with that, I don't want to take up everybody's time here. Commissioners, do you have questions of the chief? And when we're done with that, we'll go to public comment.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Decker, for that motion. I seconded. I don't know what that was. And just want to echo the concerns there. First of all, I really appreciate the chief's thorough overview and diligence in addressing both matters, the gang database and the RIPA data, and appreciate what you shared about, in many ways, the LAPD's, following the best practices, leading the way for many departments in some of these cases. And I think you, Chief, and the LAPD has shown a greater level of accountability and transparency and really acknowledging the impact, the negative impact, particularly on Black and brown people of these stops and the gang database. And I really just want to lift up, my personal concern. I've long been troubled by the gang database, and I know that it's undergoing reforms and revisions thanks to strong activism by many people here and in the community, and that the department is responding to that. So perhaps we could add, make a friendly amendment to the motion to, can I do that now, or I'll just suggest it, that we have a report back to the commission on a more thorough review of the gang database, including the concerns that have been raised, the revisions that are being considered and implemented, and how we can continue to maintain a higher level of accountability and transparency with that program. The concern for me, of course, is that it has the impact of criminalizing people who have, in many cases, done nothing wrong, and it's targeted toward Black and brown people and can really have tremendously negative outcomes for people, as we've heard time and time again. And so I want to make sure that we're doing our job to really oversee that and make the improvements that are necessary. And similarly with the RIPA data, to obviously acknowledging that pretext stops and other stops are targeting Black and brown people and at an extremely and destructively high rate. And I appreciate the chief and the department's response to the data that came out with the LA Times and our own data to strongly curb those practices, and want to continue to see a strong response and a strong reduction of those practices. So I look forward to I appreciate the motion and look forward to the IG's review of the RIPA data and additional recommendations for how we can continue to reduce the disparate impact on Black and brown people in Los Angeles.
Thank you. Other questions of the chief?
Thank you. First, I suppose on just a couple of potential friendly amendments to the motion that was made. One is that I would like the IG also to suggest and ensure, how we can ensure a proper level of transparency, on the outcome of the investigations, also in terms of what fully was is found. So we want to, and what other actions may be taken by the commission or otherwise to look forward and how we can avoid these kinds of circumstances in the future. Somewhat associated with that also, I'd like a comment on, because it's my understanding, and correct me, Chief, if I'm wrong, but I think you indicated that the investigations have been going on for some time. And it's not clear to me, simply because we're kind of thinking about this anew, what systems we may have in place also that may have allowed this kind of activity to go on for some time without detection. And so I'd like also, as part of the IG's comment, working with the department, some thoughts on what institutional or other organizational changes may be appropriate to address these, to make sure that we can avoid these kind of situations in the future. A couple of questions for the chief also, because I want to respect the sensitivity to the ongoing investigation. So these are questions just asked kind of in general. One question, what is the protocol in these cases? Like, which of these kinds of investigations might otherwise come to the attention of the commission through the subcommittee or otherwise? What is the typical protocol in that regard?
So, based on the discretion of the president, our conversations typically between the president and/or a select number of commissioners, that so as not to violate the Brown Act as to a significant personnel investigation occurs as investigations unfold and at the discretion of the chair, the president, as well as myself.
In this particular case, was this set of investigations something that was on the brought to the attention of the subcommittee or any part of the commission?
This was briefed with the president earlier than the public announcement, yes.
Okay. Also, you mentioned the officers involved who are assigned to home duty. In cases generally, and what does that really involve? Are they getting paid during the time that they're on home duty? And then what is the process for revisiting that, or what is the outcome if there is some finding of wrongdoing?
Yes. So discipline as a matter of protocols, if you will, is defined by the LA City Charter and affords the chief of police certain rights and responsibilities and also limitations. Presently, an officer who is suspected or involved in allegations of alleged misconduct, prior to that matter being directed to a tribunal and a board of rights for the purposes of serious misconduct removal, the chief is limited as to his or her ability to restrict the officer to such as a suspension of pay. I am afforded the authority to governing the officer's ability to exercise his or her peace officer powers, and in most serious actions of alleged misconduct will notify the officer that his or her peace officer powers have been suspended, that they're inactive, they're not to rely upon them or use them, or act in the course and scope of a police officer. Their assignment to home is my authority to cause them, while still receiving pay, to stay at a location and to call in and make checks and ensure that they are there during the investigative process. Once the investigation reaches an opportunity of a due process of determining the facts and circumstances, where there's a preponderance of evidence to sustain or support the allegation did occur, then that affords me the opportunity to then impose discipline. I'm limited by the charter in the imposition of discipline for anything greater than a 22-day suspension. That matter must be then directed to a board of rights, a tribunal, for adjudication by a 3-member panel who hears the evidence, witnesses, cross-examination, advocacy by the department's advocate, as well as defense by attorneys upon the accused, and then deliberates and comes to a finding as a result of a preponderance of evidence standard that finds guilt or innocence. In the finding of guilt or innocence, then they have the ability to impose, in a sense of discipline, when guilty is found, the finding, they impose discipline up to and including termination. That is then forwarded to me, and within 10 days I act on either affirming that discipline or lowering it. I do not have the ability by charter to increase the discipline. So in answering your questions, the officers who are assigned presently to home, that is the greatest extent of my ability in dealing with this personnel administrative investigation.
And did I understand you that that's the extent of your authority, and then the board can impose greater discipline, which you can uphold?
Yes, the board.
Subsequently?
Once these investigations have not moved into an adjudication phase. So once that occurs, I've just described the process of what flows from there. The board were to find, a tribunal were to find in allegations of serious misconduct that the evidence is presented by the department supports those allegations, and they believe that the appropriate discipline is removal. That would be moved to me, and I can affirm that and do or not. but I cannot increase it. So if they chose to give a suspension of 22 days versus a termination, which my recommendation would be termination, I cannot reinstate my recommendation. The Office of Inspector General monitors those outcomes and has reported independently to this commission in the past relative to this chief's exercise of discipline.
And in regards to what you described at length this morning, is that the full scope of investigations that are underway?
So no, this is, as I meant to convey, was that this investigation continues to look at instances involving initially the 3 officers, and then officers who then worked with those 3 officers, and then officers who then worked with that set of officers. There's a term I used yesterday before the Watts Gang Task Force of a clear margin. It's my intention for this investigation to continue to ensure that while we have currently found numbers of instances in which the officer's conduct was appropriate, professional, and accurate in their depiction, we've also found some inaccuracies. I want to continue the breadth of this until we have a clear margin and demonstrate that a high level of conviction that we have found the universe of the depths of this. Additionally, I've asked the Office of Constitutional Policing to look at all Metropolitan Division FI cards, field interview cards, and to, on a sampling basis, review the evidence that underlines those. These numbers can be in the thousands. But I've asked her independent through the audit division to look at the body of evidence, and any discrepancies found are then going to be referred to Personnel Standards Bureau for investigation as far as a personnel matter. So the depth and breadth of this is meant to just to the commission's interest, or I'm share and its department shares, is understanding how isolated or not pervasive this is. Secondly, we have implemented in the interim, we have implemented processes where every FI card that alleges or asserts that by statements that this individual was gang involved, prior to that entry into the CalGang's database, the lieutenant working the gang intervention section of that command has to review the body-worn video and evidence to the nature of that stop to validate that the depiction of what's written on that card is accurate and complete and valid before that is moving. That it was not a process that was previously placed. It was a recommendation that we made to the California Attorney General that a supervisor would review those facts and circumstances going forward. But given the seriousness of this, working with the Chief of Operations, we have decided that the 21 gang intervention teams, those Lieutenant 2s, would be the clearinghouse point for that important decision.
Okay, and also in addition to that, what I'm also asking is all of what you're describing purely subject of administrative reviews, or is, for example, if I falsified a police report or someone falsified a police report, there may be some criminal exposure or criminal activity. So I'm asking, is there any criminal investigation underway in addition to the administrative?
I'm sorry, I'm not being clear. This is the conduct it's a personnel investigation involving conduct which does include criminal aspects. And our conversations and meeting and deliberation with the LA County District Attorney's Office is relative to their review of the criminal aspects of the conduct alleged. And so this is very much a two-part investigation. There's a criminal aspect of it, which the officers' accounts, absent a voluntary statement, are protected from self-incrimination. And then there's an administrative part where, regardless of the criminal aspect, we can and will compel officers to provide their own testimony on the administrative side. So this is every investigation that every personal investigation that this department engages in has a criminal aspect potential and an administrative aspect in all instances. This instance definitely has a criminal aspect as to falsifying information on a department report is a crime.
Thank you. I think the other, observation I would make is, and this relates to some of the other things we'll get to on the agenda relative to the public sentiment survey and the like, because I think there's a lot of information that suggests, every time you have, it's one thing to report the good data and statistics and things, but when you have this kind of incident, it has reverberating impacts, far into the future and across the community and the department. And one discussion I want to make sure we continue to have this year when we report on the crime statistics. I mentioned this a couple meetings ago in regards to ComStat, but I think, we do a pretty good job of reporting, just crime data and statistics, and I don't think we often go as far as, or I don't think at all we go as far as we need to go, and also finding a way to capture the social cost of achieving some of these results. And in particular, like when I look at the strategic plan that has a discussion of organizational accountability and some of those efforts, what I want to do is work with you in finding a way to better capture not just the perceived positives that come about in crime data, but also just the full picture, that round out the full picture also with the what I've referred to before as accountability data, but I'm really referring to the other elements, like in this case, this incident, when this is all the investigations are done. I think we need to find a way to capture not just the positive outcomes that are being achieved, but also what it's cost to get there, and also those areas where we're clearly falling short and need to continue working as well.
Absolutely.
So, thank you. One last question, a different topic. If we're this is on the child abuse cases. Were you, just to clarify, the situation you described? Are you making changes so that we will simply certify that there is no LAPD investigation, or are you also at least going to determine whether anybody is investigating? In other words, we're not simply just going so far as to say it's not our issue, so there's no law enforcement investigation.
Well, there is a working group team of each of the partners in the eSCAR system. So mandated reporters, agencies that have investigative responsibilities. There are areas of responsibilities. We do not govern that collection or the totality of that universe. We're a member on a team and a working group member. So we cannot attest and do not investigate, for instance, instances absent allegations of some criminality by Department of Children and Family Services as to their actions. Those are matters for the Department of Children and Family Services and the LA County Board of Supervisors. It's not within my...
Are we saying we can't even... I think the concern is that that there's no shortage of government efforts where something slips through a crack, and it slips through the crack because you have a lot of agencies involved, and everybody says, we did our part of it, and we're not responsible for whatever somebody else is doing. And then you find out at the end that something slipped through a crack. So it's not asking the department to take on responsibility that otherwise wouldn't be there, but to figure out if all these people are in a room, they've got to be able to come up with a system to make sure that that we've determined that maybe you're not investigating, but at least it's in the hands of the appropriate department or agency that should be, if that's warranted.
So two aspects. First of all, the first aspect is I believe the system itself has that characteristic as far as visibility and accountability, so people are aware that this is in your shop and you acknowledge it. But I do believe that the effort to put a multidisciplinary team together, to bring in Department of Children and Family Services investigators and co-locate with us, so that when investigations of eSCARs come in, and this is a matter that's within the dominion and control by agreement of the Department of Children and Family Services, that they're sitting at this desk and I'm sitting here. This is your book of work. This is my book of work. How do we compare and work together towards the safety of these young people? And I think and I've received support from their director and the rank and file. I believe that this next year is going to be a good turning point of improving our relationship with the Department of Children and Family Services by co-locating so we can better understand the risks to the children in Los Angeles.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
No further questions.
Okay, thank you. We'll turn then to public comment. Colleagues, we'll do that after public comment. But I've been informed by the city attorney just procedurally, we'll be instructing the inspector general, it's not a formal motion. But we'll get to that after a public comment. Madam Secretary, how many public comment cards are there in this item?
Yes, we have 11.
11.
The first 3, Michael Novick, Jonathan Foster, and Paula Miner.
Thank you.
So first of all, it's outrageous that you changed the agenda and started with the chief's report. So if there are late cards, you have to accept all those late cards and people to turn cards in. It's unfair. Second, I think that tremendous amount of material. I think that you haven't met in over a month. You should allow more than 2 minutes for public comment on each of these. So I think this is the first report in quite some time, well into December. You've been about almost a month with no meetings. I'm curious from the chief, how many shootings took place in 2019 by the LAPD? How many people were killed in those shootings? How many deaths in custody occurred during the course of the entire year of 2019? You need to have those figures before you. The relationship between the racial identity disclosures, which were shocking, and the Metro Division and the rest of what you're talking about should be blatant to everybody. The idea that this occurred because one mother objected that her son was in a gang database when people have been here week after week telling you that LAPD is criminalizing black and brown people, and that you expose the fact yourselves that your so-called predpol, predatory policing, results in falsification of people being identified as suspicious characters or chronic offenders when there was no basis whatsoever, begs belief. I think that the question of 36,000 reported suspected child abuse in this city reflects a social crisis of enormous proportions, and maybe it's because LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Department are soaking up so much resources of public money that you're not able to provide the kinds of social assistance, jobs, training, education, and support and housing that would allow people to raise their children in decency and respect. Fuck you all.
Mr. Foster?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Foster. I love being in the room with the smartest people in LA. Notice who's not here, though. And there was a week, Chief, where there was no use of force, right? There was a good week, another good week. And on the e-scars, you went from 30 days to 10 days. And notice Charlie Beck never did this. Many of the changes, Charlie Beck never addressed, like shooting unarmed people. Also, the money on the e-scars dealing with Child Protective Services, the Pentagon's eating up $500 billion a year, and so the money doesn't go to the Department of Child Services, Protective Services. We can't protect the children because the Pentagon's eating the money. You all cannot talk while someone else is speaking then at all. If they have a comment and the president says, she was elected without a full quorum, the unethical, un-American, with no freedom jerk with blonde hair, satanic liar will tell somebody out here they can't speak up. So you can't talk ever. Nobody up there better say a word when somebody else is standing here. The 21st century policing is corrupt, but that's what this and most police departments operate from, and it's demanded on these departments by quid pro quo. If the department says no, the Fed withholds the money in objection to 21st policing money, and that's corrupt. And I'd be happy with an all-black police department. I'd be happy if you were all black up there. I'd be happy. And President, stop saying please. Stop saying that.
Ms. Minor?
The State Department of Justice reported that black people throughout the state experience police stops at a rate higher than any other ethnic group and grossly disproportionate to their number in the population. They confirm what we as black people have known and experienced for decades and what BLM has been saying for 6 years. The report also confirmed that LAPD stops black people, especially young black men, at the most excessive rate. Then it was revealed a few days later that the Metro Division was falsely putting the names of innocent people it stopped into the gang database, basically falsifying field interview cards, lying, committing perjury, being dishonest, illegal, and shameful while continuing their oppression of black people and trying to ruin lives. Last year, the mayor told LAPD to reduce the stops in South Central. So what did you guys do? You fake interview cards to boost stop statistics. Also, all the officers you identified are Metro. So Chief Moore, if you didn't know about it, you're negligent as a superior. If you did know about it, it's horrendous. This is a horrible example of racial bias and racial profiling because Black people are stopped the most, names entered into that database. If these people ever have a criminal charge, it means the sentencing will be enhanced and the harshest. Other people will not be able to pass background checks. People will not be able to get certain loans and certain benefits. And once the names are in there, it's extremely difficult to get them out, especially because LAPD uses their own personal assumptions to put those names in there, like where the people live, who they associate, whether their clothing is considered gang colors, which means any one of us can be entered into that database after being stopped for a broken tail light. So Chief Moore, you are responsible. We do not trust LAPD, and your community trust talk is a fake and a cover-up.
Who are the next three speakers, please?
Keely, Adam Smith, and Audrey George.
Keely with Black Lives Matter, and I have some statements I'd like to share with you, Madam Chair. This report that you received from the state and that was in the LA Times is a classic example of institutional racism, the continued criminalization of Black people, and the dismissal and denial of our truth. We've been saying that for a long time. So as you get those demands, there are 8 of them. We demand the Los Angeles Police Department immediately cease the use of gang database. We demand that Chief Moore immediately disband the Metro Division. We demand Chief Moore publicly release the names of all officers found to have engaged in corrupt practices. We demand that the District Attorney, Jackie Lacey, prosecute officers who are engaged in corrupt practices. We demand that the City Attorney and the District Attorney drop all charges against those currently being prosecuted as a result of arrests made by these officers. We demand individuals currently incarcerated or on parole or probation as a result of these arrests and the names of the officers be made public, that they be released. We demand that the Attorney General, Javier Becerra, launch an immediate independent investigation into the Los Angeles Police Department. And finally, we demand the mayor to establish a fund of reparations unit in South Los Angeles that begins to make whole and remedy the individuals who have been harassed by the police force. 337,000 stops. 28% of those stops were Black people. That's about 90,000 Black people that have been stopped and harassed by this police department.
Thank you,
and
sir.
Nothing has been done. We have a set of demands, and we want you to not only embrace these demands, but implement them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Smith, I believe you're next.
Do you want to double check or?
No, sir.
Chief, do you know what the hashtag 3 a day in LA refers to? I'll tell you. 3 people a day die houseless in Los Angeles, if not more. Let me tell you quickly about my friend Miranda. My kids and I have gotten to know Miranda, a 61-year-old Black woman who made her home in an encampment under the 405 on Venice Boulevard pretty well over the last year. I've spent time at that encampment multiple times a week over that past year. A lot of time observing your officers leading the charge and stealing and throwing away people's stuff. Of your officers, like the 4 I have video of, 3 senior lead officers from Pacific Division, including current Venice senior lead officer Adrian Acosta, holding a taser in his hand while they stood over a Black houseless person curled up with his head in his hands. I watched as LA sanitation workers and LAPD officers crossed Venice Boulevard into Culver City and stole Miranda's tent. A month ago, I was helping folks organize a citywide memorial for the National Homeless Memorial Day to lift up the names of local houseless folks that died in our city in 2019. While I was making a banner with names and faces of folks, I got a phone call that my friend Miranda was found dead. I see your officers at and around that encampment every time I'm there, and there's no way your officers didn't know Vincent Valencia, especially a fucking supervisor. We want to hear the 911 call your supervisor responded to. We want to see the video, not in 45 days. We want to see it today. 2 nights ago, your officers were walking around to different businesses trying to pull video. For what? You should be absolutely ashamed that every day we see the LAPD as the first point of contact with houseless folks, the first point of contact with folks struggling with mental health issues, and every day we see death. From Brendan Glenn to Charlie Africa to Jason Davis to Vincent Valencia. And you, fucking police commission, who claim to be our voice, claim to be civilian oversight, not only didn't you not ask a question today about the murder of Vincent Valencia, you didn't even fucking acknowledge it.
Ms. George.
Vincent Valencia! Say his name! Vincent Valencia! Say his name!
Vincent Valencia! This major scandal of corruption of LAPD officers, this latest major scandal, would never have seen the light of day if it weren't for the media already about to expose it. We know that the investigation internally has been ongoing. It would have stayed silent. These officers manufacturing false allegations and filing false reports, those reports, those allegations have a tremendous effect on the lives of Black and brown people, poor people, many of which might have resulted in them being killed, and we'll never know. Regarding Vincent Valencia, you must admit very publicly, and contrary to what media reports have been so far, that the cops killed an unarmed man who they knew had mental health issues, who they had met before. How many cops were sent out on that call? We need to know that too. Populations of houseless people, other folks with mental health and skin color issues are triggered by sounds, by just the presence of police. They're terrified. They're fearful and they have no trust. I want to know that the public perception that was initially created by false reports of Mr. Valencia having a weapon, a gun, that those should be repudiated loud and clear, and that his name will not be besmirched by those false allegations.
Thank you. Who are the next 3 speakers, please?
Mr. Herman, Dr. Melina Abdullah, and Jeremy Tramer.
Yes, good morning. You can't say good morning around here without that being noise. That's not noise. That's the content of what I speak to you. Because you're nothing more but immoral, strategic lawsuits against the public to participate. So you want to intimidate and harass me the way the police harass people with mental disabilities. That's why I brought your sign in, the Holocaust under HHH crisis, in which all of you are aware that the city, Mike Fear's office, fuck Javier Becerra are doing shit to fix the problem, Mr. Mark P. Smith, Inspector General for the record. So I brought for your information a universal sign as well. Another issue regarding why police continue to fuck children. Why you continue to lie on police
Not addressing
reports.
anything that was relevant to
That's
the
a conspiracy
chief's
to
report
intimidate
that
me
was on
again,
the
madam.
agenda,
I got
sir.
the floor. I'm speaking
Sir,
about
you're off
crimes. I'm
topic.
speaking
You
about
still
your
have
hate
to
speech towards me
address the
because I'm
issues
disabled
presented in
and
the
you
chief's
rather
report, sir.
interrupt me under the Brown Act.
Sir,
60 seconds is
you're
all
off
I ask
topic.
for from this fucking government, and this is
Mr.
how
City
they
Attorney,
disrespect
am I
us.
correct that
Because
he's off
I'm an
topic?
American citizen. So for the record, I brought a letter regarding SLAPP for you, Madam Decker, for you, Mr. Moore, and for you, Mr. Smith. So all this is public record content. All this shit I bring regarding the police, redefine, resurrender, reserve, all this fucking propaganda is bullshit, and you're hearing it from the public's testimony. There you go, public. That's my
Please take, officer, please take all of that material off the podium. Thank you, sir. Dr. Abdullah, and then Mr. Tramer.
So when Adam was speaking, I didn't see any of you all moved, but I was. And I think it's really important that you remember that these policies that you enact, these practices that you enact coldly, has real world consequences. So when we talk about people being stopped and frisked and harassed and put into gang databases, these are real people. I'm gonna start with a story of my own son. When he was 6 years old, the LAPD gang unit visited my house, alleging that my son, a first grader, somehow belonged in a gang database. So when we're talking about what's happening in community, you have to remember you don't work for him. You're supposed to be working for us. Dale Bonner, you have a special calling. You're supposed to represent black people. Now, you may not want to think that, but that's why you're on this commission. And so it's important that when we said meetings need to be held in communities, you come out to the community so you can hear from us what's happening to us. Don't rely on LAPD reports that they've been holding on to for 10 months and then forced to release because they feared exposure. Come to the community. Don't be afraid of the community you're supposed to represent. So in addition to the demands that Baba Akili read to you, we're calling on you to have a community meeting in South Los Angeles so you can hear from us exactly what's happening. It's not 12 officers who are harassing us, who are falsifying evidence, who are engaging in corruption and really criminal behavior. It's much more widespread, and if you would listen to the people you're supposed to represent, you would understand that, and maybe it would compel you to act.
Thank you. And who are the final two speakers after Mr. Tramer?
Jamie Garcia and Mateo Nagasi.
Thank you.
Don't shoot. This isn't a bicycle part. It's just a cell phone. How can we trust the LAPD to use guns when they don't know what a gun looks like? Aren't guns like your main thing? Like, isn't the free pass to use a gun on whoever you want with zero consequences the only reason any of you even became cops? Yet, a quote-unquote bicycle part gets mistaken for a gun, and you kill Vincent Valencia because of it. If a cop can't recognize a gun, they need to be fired. If a chef couldn't recognize a spoon, they would be fired. If a judge couldn't recognize a gavel, they would be fired. If someone on the Lakers kept trying to dunk bike handlebars instead of basketballs during games, he'd be out of a job. Yet I'm sure you'll not only refuse to fire the officers who killed a man for holding a quote-unquote bicycle part last weekend, but you won't even rule the shooting out of policy. And in terms of your racial bias reporting, I've heard a lot of embarrassing stuff from the people who sit up here over the years, but it's hard to think of many things more laughable than Chief Moore's spin on racial bias statistics. The LAPD was found to have 3 times more reports of racial bias than any other department in the state, 260-something in 1 year, and he framed that not as a searing indictment of his officers, but as a win for the LAPD's easy-to-use racial bias reporting system. Obviously, this logic can be used to reframe literally any damning statistic. Anytime a statistic exposes you for the monsters you are, it's because other departments just don't report as thoroughly as you do. And the question isn't how many reports there are anyways, the question is what you do about them. You get many more than 260 racial bias reports each year from the public just in this room. And not only are they completely dismissed, they're usually met with outright hostility. So Chief Moore, just stop embarrassing yourself and retire.
Ms. Garcia? I believe Ms. Garcia is next, sir.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
So I've been tweeting at you more about what more you're going to be responsible now that we're seeing everything around the gang database. And so this is my friendly amendment to what you're instructing the Inspector General to do. Because let's go back now, just a couple months, and let's think about Operation Laser. And this is the problem with data-driven policing, is databases. Databases that are created by LAPD, not only with falsified data, but the fact that they're just used to criminalize us, to pull us out of communities like tumors, right? So field interview cards and gang identification. What were the 5 things a part of the laser risk assessment? Field interview cards, gang identification were all key components. You already know through the Inspector General's audit that they were falsifying people on the COB list. So how much bigger is this problem? He can't answer on Twitter because he knows it's a bigger problem. So this is the problem with how data gets operationalized. So if you want to really know what's going on, you better instruct him to go even deeper and to look at Operation Laser. Because just as all my colleagues are raising here, that this impacts people's lives. So now people were targeted. And Metro, I have thousands of maps that I've gotten from the public records request that demonstrate how Metro was enacting Laser in 2016 when they did the full-on assault on South LA. So this problem is huge. It is huge. It is beyond just this fucking gang database. This is a part of how his department continues to falsify things, continues to assault. I mean, we have PredPol, we have COBs, we have digital in-car video systems, we have you falsifying Part 1 crimes into misdemeanors. How many more times? How much more? You must be dismantled. Gang databases must be dismantled. You need to do your fucking job and look at how much bigger this problem is. That is the friendly amendment. Do the job now. Don't make us do it again.
Ms.
Ask
Garcia,
for a
thank
bigger
you.
investigation. Open this up, Bonner. You know it's deeper.
Thank you, ma'am.
I've been a victim of police falsifying reports. I was arrested with the assistance of LAPD and a completely fabricated story by DHS, but nonetheless was assisted by LAPD, where you totally took an incident of protest and you criminalized me, and 2 months later you came and snatched me out of my bed in August and took me to jail. You've totally fabricated that story. I had 15 witnesses, you had 4. You had 2 officers, the officer who wrote the report and then somebody else that didn't show up. You have found no evidence against me, and yet you ended up dismissing the case. And although this is not directly towards LAPD, we will be suing them. I just wanted to bring that up because it's just the history of law enforcement. You don't solve crimes, you create crimes, you fabricate crimes, you frame people, you get people killed. And to speak about this gang database, I mean, it said state auditors found 42 people who had been entered into the gang database when they were infants. I mean, how does that happen when you're an infant? And that 28 of those infants, right, and then 28 of those infants were listed because they admitted to being gang members. This is the Cal Gang database. I mean, this is shameful, and yet these officers are continuously getting paid to do nothing, but, and you say you don't have the power to fire them. They need to be fired. That's all.
Thank you, sir. With that, colleagues, as I'm told by the city attorney, we have to proceed by instruction to the Inspector General. Mr. Tiefenk, I would ask that you would write this up in the form of a memo that can be transmitted to the Inspector General.
Will you accept the demands? Will you accept the demands?
Mr. Tiefenk, will you create a memorandum that will be forwarded?
Absolutely. We'll get with the transcript from the
Thank
recorder.
Can I add a friendly amendment to the instruction?
Will you act on the demands?
Sir, please don't shout out.
No,
Thank you.
don't, listen, don't tell me that.
Sir, please.
Do not tell me that.
Sir, I'm asking you not to shout out in the middle of the meeting, sir.
I had 2 minutes, and we gave
Sir?
you the demands,
Sir?
and you didn't respond to them at all.
Sir, we received them. We need to
But you
review
asked
them. Sir, this is not the time that we will be discussing this.
I would like to ask that we do have a
Don't
special
tell me to sit down. This is a public meeting.
Sir, I've asked you to sit down, sir. I've asked you repeatedly to please sit down.
I would
Please, Mr.
like
Akili.
to ask that we have a special community meeting in South LA to address the concerns related to the database and stops the black and brown people in South LA and whatever other issues are of concern to the people in this room and to residents in South LA, so that we can, at a time and a location convenient to them, where they can make sure that we are hearing those stories and addressing those concerns.
And what I was going to say at the end of the meeting was that we have already scheduled a meeting. The specific date is waiting for all the commissioners to advise their availability for South Los Angeles, at which it will be scheduled for March, because that is when the community room is available, when we can order chairs. There are logistics. Thank you very
I
much.
appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. I know it's a lot of work to organize these meetings in the community, and would just ask that we provide the community as much advance notice as possible of the date, so they can organize a critical mass of people to come out and share their stories with us.
And as soon as each commissioner gets back to Mr. Tiefenk, we can schedule that date.
Just, Madam Chair,
Yes.
one other comment before the IG leaves his list. One other thing I'd like to understand is there was reference in the public comment period to the understanding not only the impact, but what we do in the case of those who have been wrongfully misidentified as in the gang database. So I'd like to have a full explanation on that front as well, in terms of clearly we know some individuals have been wrongfully misidentified, and the question just is, aside from any action that may be taken as appropriate relative to the officers involved, what other steps are appropriate to address the potential impact on those who have been wrongfully caught up in this set of activity?
Absolutely. We can add that to the instruction to the Inspector General. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Garcia, please. Please, I'm asking you to please. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the public, please. We need to get the full analysis. That is the proper procedure, to get the full analysis and report from the Inspector General. We would all like to move forward on this. We all find this very disturbing, but we, you know, Mr. Smith, I've already given you a warning, sir.
The police
And
should not be investigating themselves.
this is the Inspector General. Members of the public, please, I am asking you to allow us to follow the procedure that we do to review and uncover all the issues of concern so we can act. And I realize this is not at the speed with which you want to proceed. I understand that. I truly do. Members of the public, members of the public, the Inspector General has been reviewing this, and we will await his report before acting. Thank you very much. We will instruct the Inspector General to proceed with his investigation. And members of the public, should there be further yelling during the meeting, I'll have to excuse you. And I do not, Ms. Garcia, please, I do not want to excuse her from this meeting, please. We've moved forward. Dr. Abdullah, please. Dr. Abdullah, please have a seat. Very well, Doctor. You've had your opportunity to speak. I'm going to have to either ask you to leave or we'll go into recess. Dr. Abdullah, I do appreciate your passion, Doctor. Dr. Abdullah, please have a seat, Doctor. I'm asking you to please have a seat, Dr. Abdullah.
We can't sit here
All
and
right.
just be quiet about it.
We have instructed the Inspector General, and that is the correct process for us to follow. Dr. Abdullah, I understand you disagree. Please have a seat, Dr. Abdullah. Please have a seat, Dr. Abdullah. All right, given Dr. Abdullah, you're going to have to be excused from today's meeting because at this point we can't proceed. I am listening, Doctor. Please have a seat. Dr. Abdullah, you're going to have to leave the meeting, ma'am.
Police department in the country.
Very well.
An emergency.
Since we cannot proceed with our meeting,
Data, listen to the people.
since we cannot proceed from the meeting, we will clear the room and we will go into closed session to proceed with those matters, and we will return once the room is cleared and proceed with the remainder of the matters. Thank you very much.
You need to care. You need to do more. Say it.
The Board of Police Commissioners will now recess into closed session to discuss items 4A1, 4A2 in accordance to Government Code 54957.
Did a great job. Great face of your.
The other gentleman's with the department.
All right, thank you very much. Apologies for the delay in getting restarted, but because the room had been clear previously, there were individuals still in the room. Officers had to need to complete that process. Colleagues, just to pick up where we left off, and so that the record is clear, we will proceed by instructing the Inspector General of actions he needs to take with respect to the ongoing investigation and the RIPA data as indicated earlier and as amended by my colleagues. We will now return to the agenda and proceed in order. Items A through D, colleagues, are a series of donations. Do any of you have any questions regarding the donations, items A through D?
Madam President, excuse me, we need to report out from closed session before we begin the regular portion of the return to the
Oh, I'm
meeting.
sorry. Thank you, Mr. Tiefenk. Please do so.
Madam Secretary?
In closed session, items 4A1 was discussed and the chief's recommendations were unanimously adopted by a vote of 4-0. Item 4A2 was also discussed and the chief's recommendations were unanimously adopted by a vote of 4-0.
Thank you, and apologies on that. Colleagues, are there any questions regarding the donations listed in agenda items A through D? And I will note that with respect to item D, the recommendation is that we approve the report and accept the donations as opposed to transmit it to the city clerk. Are there any questions? Seeing none, I will move that we approve the department's report and accept the donations as listed in items A through D. Is there a second? Second. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Thank you. Item E is a request to have the authority to destroy obsolete duplicate records as indicated, and the recommended action is to approve the department's report and transmit to the city clerk. Are there any questions? Seeing none, I will move that we proceed forward, approve the department's report and transmit. Is there a second to that motion? Second. Second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Passes 4-0. Thank you very much. Mr. Tiefenk, was there a request from the department to advance one of the items F through G?
Yes, there was, to advance the item G, which is the contract, or excuse me, agreement between the City of Los Angeles and Loyola Marymount University.
Very well. Then can whoever from the department was prepared to present and answer questions come forward? Good morning, Chief.
Good afternoon, Ms.
Good
Decker.
afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Good afternoon, Chief, Inspector General as well. With me here today, if I may introduce, I have the pleasure of introducing Associate Director of the Center for the Study of LA, and this is Professor Bree Gilbert. And she is joined by researcher Vishnu Akella, who is also going to be participating, hopefully, in this endeavor. Would you like me to give a slight overview?
Please do, Chief.
Okay. In 2019, Chief Moore directed the department to seek out and identify potential institutions or organizations who could partner with the department, who were respected by the community, this was a must, and who had prior experience in taking a look at different segments of police and community interactions within the city of Los Angeles. So as we took a look, and I want to thank my colleague, Lieutenant Mario Mota, for his partnership in this, as we took a look at various institutions within the region, we kept circling back to Loyola Marymount University, the work of Bree Gilbert, and also, of course, Dr. Fernando Guerra, who heads the Dorothy and Thomas Levy Institute there at the Center for the Study of LA. Many people are familiar with the publication Forecast LA that not only covers LA City and County, but takes a comprehensive look and is all-inclusive, taking account the diversity of the entire region and looking at it in very pointed, important ways through the use of focus groups, online phone and other means to gather up a pool of questions from the community of things that matter to them, in particularly the areas of public trust, the quality of police services, professionalism, and public sentiment in general toward law enforcement in their communities. So as we had discussions, and I went over with colleagues to Loyola Marymount University, met with Dr. Guerra, met with Professor Gilbert, to pick their brains on how they thought that they could be useful, not primarily to the department for their input, but also to the community in giving voice to concerns and being able to analyze it in such a way that it was worth its while, it was worth the money, it was worth the effort, and the department could have lessons learned. We talk about quality through continuous improvement. What does that really mean to the department? It means having an objective, respective outside source take a look at where the LAPD not only thinks it is internally, but where is it in the eyes of the community. And that is the road that we want to travel with our partners from LMU. What I think is very important to this partnership as well is they are also connected with the Transparency Innovation Group of the individuals who audit within this area. So transparency is something that LMU is looking to incorporate in every aspect of the methodology that they are using here, as well as the evaluation and future presentations as well. So I think that rather than me hijack this conversation, I think it's important for the commissioners to hear a little bit about the methodology. Where will LMU and their researchers be looking for the questions from the focus groups so that we can appropriately and respectfully hear from the community and test the waters of where we think we are and where in reality within the city of Los Angeles we find ourselves. So if at this point in time I'd like to turn it over to Professor Gilbert and Vishnu as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Chief, and thank you very much to the commissioners and to the chief for having us here today. So we were very, very excited, just to be very frank, about this possible partnership when we first met with Chief Grimala and later on meeting with Chief Moore as well. For us at Study LA, having the opportunity to be surveying Angelenos, we literally have Angelenos conducting the surveys, and they're talking with other Angelenos. And then to have this data for the Angeleno community is of highest priority. As the chief mentioned, we are part of the Transparency Initiative. Not only are we part of the Transparency Initiative, we were charter members when the Transparency Initiative from the American Association of Public Opinion Research was first developed, and we first heard about it. We said that's something that speaks very, very true to what we do at Study LA. So we went through the rigorous process to apply, and then we've renewed that membership as well. So as we're thinking about the upcoming projects, we currently, there's a couple different components for what we're going to be doing. One is we have a survey out in the field right now, the LA Public Opinion Survey, and we have added questions to that survey. It's in the field right now. If anybody in this room gets a call, please be sure to answer your phone. It's something that we have both landline, cell phone, and online that we're asking 2,000 Angeleno residents, adult residents, their feelings and their attitudes and beliefs on a number of different topics. One of them being LAPD, such as trust, such as transparency, and then such as a rating of police services. And then we will also be conducting focus groups over the next couple months as we prepare for a survey, a standalone survey just focused on LAPD and the interactions and the transparency and the relationships with the community. And that survey would take place in late spring or early summer. And then we would be compiling all of the data from these reports into as many presentations and into reports as is agreed upon, so that we can get the data out there to as many people as possible.
If I could add, Professor Gilbert referenced adding some questions. That was to their ongoing study that will be published soon, I believe. Is that in March or April?
So our conference will be on April 1st, and that's where we initially release all of the data. And then we'll be collecting that data from now. We started at the very beginning of January and goes throughout the very beginning of February.
And for clarity, that's something apart from what they will be doing with the standalone survey, the focus groups, etc. When we met with Chief Moore and Bree, Dr. Guerin, the staff, they were very kind to include additional questions in the interim because the chief was very concerned that he got a good read early on where public trust is before we actually launch a full-blown standalone survey, etc. I think what's also important, and we were very pleased to hear from LMU, is their way that they're going to outreach to the community. And Commissioner Bonner, I know you've spoken in the past several times about your concern that surveys, audits, etc., touch all Angelenos, not just those who are tech savvy, those that have access to social media, those that may be within that group that lives and works on and off their phones. What about the people who don't have access? Mm-hmm. What about the low-income community members who maybe go to a local library to access those types of tools? Mm-hmm. And I think, and Professor Gilbert, if you could talk a little bit about that, the importance of ensuring that everyone's voice is heard, not just those who may be savvy in 2020 to use these different devices. And I think that'll speak, Commissioner Bond, I'm not trying to preempt your question, but I know that that's very dear to your heart as far as ensuring that those communities and their members are included.
So yes, that is something we want to be very take a critical look at our own methodology so that we make sure that we really are encompassing all Angelino residents. Originally, when we talked about doing the survey, we had talked about doing something phone and online. And then after the initial conversation, we said we also need to incorporate a component where there's face-to-face, in-person interviews. As a quick anecdote, we were doing a completely separate study of downtown residents last year, and our students were out in the field. They won't be collecting this particular data, but they were collecting data, and they said, but what do we do if somebody is homeless? We just avoid them, right? We said, we're going to make this a very teachable moment because that's the exact opposite of what we want to do. We want to make sure that we're truly getting everybody's voice heard and that everybody has the potential to be included in our survey.
And I think also to that point, the flexibility for the chief to also inquire for additional focus groups in areas of concern. We open that up, of course, now that Professor Gilbert is here with the commission. If there are particular areas within the city of concern that you would like to ensure that there is that collection of data from as well, and that their voices are heard loud and clear, and what those concerns are, I think is very important as well. So we're not locked into the ability to only do X number of focus groups. We do have flexibility within the contract as written and in a fiduciary manner to add focus groups where the commission may also be desirous of them, as well as the chief of police.
Right. And that's something as we're thinking about the questions. So we want to make sure that we're pre-testing the questions. We want to make sure that we've done our due diligence in terms of understanding the literature, not only what's being discussed in academic literature, but other types of literature as well. And that we want to be able to ask these type of questions at focus groups, be able to get responses and understand if there is wording that needs to be tweaked. It could be interpreted one way by a group of researchers at a university. It could be interpreted a very different way by another group or a different community. So we want to be very, very sensitive to all of those needs as we're putting together this survey, which is also why we're doing the standalone survey a little bit later than what was initially planned, because we want to make sure we have the time to do the due diligence for all of these different elements so that we can truly do the best. It's not only LAPD's reputation, it's also Study LA. So it's important to everybody.
And I think it's important too about the multilingual capabilities of this survey system to ensure, I believe we have the Korean community, Spanish language, et cetera. So I think it's important that people have a comfort level when they are being approached by members of this research team, that they feel the ability to communicate their feelings, express their concerns in their native language if need be.
That's correct.
Thank you for that presentation. Very much appreciated. I'll open it up to questions, but Chief, I have one very specific question. I think it should be directed to you. And I should say I've read LMU studies before on LA and surveys. Certainly very well qualified, but my question is very specific about the city process. And without revealing any attorney-client privilege communications, I want to be sure that the city attorney has signed off on the process used in selecting LMU for this contract.
Yes, thank you for highlighting that. The chief was very clear that if we were to go with LMU as a sole source process, we were supposed to go by the book, ensure that every single I was dotted and T was crossed. And what truly tipped the scales in favor of LMU were several specifics. Since 1996, LMU has been collecting data for this region, both LA City and LA County. It does have a robust database, and the longitudinal study component to their work, which is something I think that is going to be very important not only for us in this survey, but moving forward. Meaning, during an extended period of time, are we looking at the same type of subset of questions, information, so we have points of comparison to see where we've come from, where we are today, and where we look to go in the future. The methodology of LMU, the reputation within the community of LMU was also very important to us. When we looked at a couple other universities, they did not have that same local body of work that we thought was very important to this specific look at public trust and public sentiment to this area. And we felt that the track record of LMU with a variety of community groups, community organizers, and community organizations was strong and seen as unbiased as possible. And it was having that transparency piece, the unbiased piece, that was very, very critical to us, because we don't want it at any juncture to appear that the Los Angeles Police Department is dictating how this survey goes, that we are pulling the strings. There has to be an autonomy, and there has to be an honesty to this process. And we saw the track record with LMU, the discussions we had, we felt assured that credibility and ethics were at the forefront of this selection process.
And Commissioner, this has been reviewed by the Office of City Attorney for form and appropriateness for sole sourcing justification.
Thank you very much.
And to that point, I have a multi-decade relationship with LMU. I serve as chair of the Levy, and have been on that for over 10 years. I had no involvement in the procurement, no involvement in the survey, and resigned when I found out that this was going to be coming to us. So my question is basically that of the city attorney. I can vote or not vote, but I think I did everything according to Hoyle. Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sobroff.
Chief, one other question. I understand in the past there have been other surveys done by the department gaining a sense of the community, perhaps different methodologies. I'm wondering, are those surveys helpful in evaluating whether the department's made progress, or is it like comparing apples and oranges because the survey would have been done so differently?
And I don't want to speak for Chief Moore, but I think this is really the inauguration of a true...
This will be the baseline.
Yeah, a baseline, a true public sentiment, public trust survey where we are touching the community. I think with prior surveys and other survey instruments, not to disparage them, they serve great purposes for us, and we respect those that participate in that. But when we actually have a human being meeting a human being and asking questions that impact their life on a daily basis, this is something new, this is something innovative, and we're proud to say that we're partnering with LMU on this with the confidence that, yes, the scars and wounds and some negative things will inevitably come forward. But I know when Chief Moore discussed this with me, he was very clear that, I want to see it all, I want to hear it all, I want to know where the public is coming from, because that's the way we're going to improve this police department, and that was the charge with which he entrusted me.
Thank you. Other questions, commissioners? Sir.
Thank you. I'm going to start, you have the agreement with you, or the proposed agreement?
Yes.
Okay, because I just wanted, I try to just go through the document if I can. So I'm going to start with the recitals up front, and this is probably more of an observation, but in the first reference there, in terms of what we're doing or why this is being done, is to determine the public's perceptions of crime, safety, satisfaction with police services, and trust in the LAPD. And I simply observe, at least in my opinion, these are separate and distinct things. They're somewhat related, but I view them as separate and distinct items. I just wanted to make sure that or understand if that's a view that's shared as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of, you were addressing this a minute ago with the longitudinal studies. And I'm not an expert in the area, but my understanding is that's typically where the person who's conducting the study or undertaking it has experience in looking at the same kind of universe of people or participants or issues. And so I want to understand, particularly given the discussion here, how much of your work is going to rely on work that's either underway or been done, and how much is going to be developed anew?
So there will be certain components that we will use from previous data. For example, we have been asking questions independent of our relationship with LAPD about public perception of trust, as well as police ratings of police services. Those have been something that we have included on our LA Public Opinion Survey since we started, some of the questions since we started in 2014. So that data we have been asking at the zip code level. So it's important for us to be able to take that data, to look at it year by year, to be able to aggregate it over the years, and then to be able to look at it by geography as we're starting to think about where we would want to hold some of our focus groups. So we'll certainly be pulling data in our experiential knowledge as we're thinking about the steps moving forward. But when we talk about reporting the longitudinal data, as Chief Grimala said, this is year one. So anything that we've done in the past would help inform us. And we're happy, we have a copy of the results. We're happy to share any of that. But in particular wording, and obviously in the full survey, there's going to be so many more questions. We've only touched upon different parts in the past. So we haven't had longitudinal data for all of the new questions that we'll be asking.
So if I'm understanding that the data that may have been developed in the past, it may inform the front end of your work, but it's not necessarily going to be baked into what I'm just going to refer to as the back end of the deliverables, the back end of the work.
Right. So we're happy to provide any of those results. It's very meaningful and academically rigorous data. So we're happy to provide those, and those do help inform us, just like other surveys that have been done of other cities, other jurisdictions throughout the United States. All that information will go to informing us. But what we're looking to do is to start afresh now in 2020 with this new data.
Okay, great. And then I did want to go on then to in the section 3, particularly 3.1.3. This is on page 4 of the agreement and the statement of work, and it's in reference to the standalone survey. And there's information there that indicates that the chief reserves some ability to designate a higher number of residents per bureau. And I just want to understand, I was pleased to hear there's some flexibility in terms of what that means and what that may address. But I'm trying to understand on the one hand how that would be done and at the same time respect the independence of the work that the chief just referenced, that we're not going to be overly involved in directing the work. So how do you on the one hand exercise this clause and at the same time do it without having too much influence on the work being done?
I would say, first of all, one of the benefits or negatives of working with Study LA is that at the end of the day, it's our research that's being put out there. So we are happy to take any kind of recommendations and suggestions. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure we're signing off on the methodology. So at the end of the day, that will be something that we want to make sure that we're obtaining the highest standards. But what we wanted to make sure we did was have a certain number of respondents within each of the 4 bureaus, but then also meet certain quotas in terms of racial and ethnic categories within the whole sample. So that at the end of the day, when we take the full data set and we weight it back to the parameters of the demographics for the city of Los Angeles, we have accurate numbers. So if we said we wanted to survey, in talking with the chief, he wants to make sure he can speak to, for example, say African Americans or Latinos or Asian Americans, we wouldn't necessarily, if we did a purely representative sample, have enough individuals in those particular categories that we could say we can speak to the views of those particular groups. But by doing an oversample, the additional 150 that we have outlined in here, by moving those to a particular racial and ethnic category, we would be able to speak to that group more definitively.
And is it only in just playing out that conversation, that hypothetical conversation, is he only speaking to the numbers? Say the number of African Americans or the number of Latinos, the number of Asians in the study?
So that was one of the areas where we noted when we talked about wanting to make sure there were enough respondents in each bureau. We said we also want to make sure we have enough of particular racial and ethnic categories. That's something for Los Angeles City and also LA County would be considered best practices. But if there was any other demographics in particular, for example, such as age, that would also be something that we would be happy to have that discussion, and then weight the data back to the accurate parameters.
That's what I'm getting at, is it's not just the numbers. You can also slice the demographic a little more discreetly too.
Oh yes,
Right.
we will be able to have a number of different demographics between age and race and gender and home ownership and their tenure, their length of time in Los Angeles, median household income. We have a whole language. We have a whole battery of questions that we'll want to ask in terms of demographics.
Okay, and then in that same 3.2 is the list of deliverables, and there's the reference to the providing the number of response rates, the descriptive analysis of the surveys, the in-depth description of the responses. Are the deliverables? Are you going to just deliver something that is just descriptive of the information that came in, and then leave to whether it's us or some other place in the department the responsibility to attach some meaning to what you deliver, and in terms of what it means and so on, or do you will you have some role in that second part of it as well?
So for some aspects, such as the response rate, it's pretty much a descriptive statistic. Like I said, we're members of the Transparency Initiative, so we want to make sure we include all of that data. We're happy to go into depth on any of the analysis. To date, I've never had somebody ask for much detail in terms of some of the more methodological nitty-gritty, but I'm more than happy to have those kind of conversations. But for our analysis, first and foremost, we want to put forth the data. We believe that not that institutions or entities should be data-driven, but they should be data-informed. So we would like to some extent to give the data and have anybody who's looking at it be able to come to their own conclusions, but we would also be providing reports on our analysis of that data.
Let me just try a couple of examples. So, for example, are you going to, and this may be captured just in terms of how you fashion the survey or the inquiries of the questions, but and at one level, I suspect much of what you're going to bring back may or may not be new or news in terms of concerns of the department, but there may be some differences from people who have a concern based on something that happened to them personally in some recent time versus something that happened to a relative 10 years ago, something like that. So will you be helping us understand, for example, not just somebody's dissatisfied, they don't trust the police, but we're trying to understand why that is? Is it relative to some recent, personal experience versus some historical experience with a relative or a friend or family?
Right, and that's one of the great distinctions, I think, with public opinion surveys, because when you have what they call, big data, when you have dashboards, you get more of the who, the what, the when, and the where. But public opinion data is really able to help delve into the why and the how, and that's really what we would like to do as part of this partnership, that all of the dashboards that have been created by LAPD and by the Commission are wonderful, but it doesn't tell the full story. So our hope is that being able to look at how the residents feel, how they think, what their attitudes are, that can help inform as well.
And from a timing standpoint, if everything goes through, how soon would it start and how long will it take?
So the standalone survey, our goal would be that in May or June, depending on how long and how many focus groups that we're hosting, how that process goes, we would start the survey and it would be in the field for about, it would be our terminology in the field. We would be running the survey for about a month, and then it would take us a couple weeks to do all of the cleaning and the coding and the weighting of the data, and then we would be ready to start release probably by the end of that next month. So we would be sharing initial reports, and then our goal is that we can provide reports, but then also get feedback if there's something that's not clear, if there's something that we need to go deeper into the data. So it's not just a one and done, here's the report and thanks, see you later. But really trying to unpack that if there's items that perhaps there's something we missed in the analysis or just a different look at something, that it really would be an iterative process and we would be able to work together in a true partnership.
Understood. One very strong suggestion I would make also to the department, this includes to the chief and others. I can tell you from, I appreciate you making reference to some of the discussions we've had about the populations that are difficult to get to and so on. But even as someone who is very capable of expressing a point of view and has a lot of point of view, I can tell you that one reason, and I probably get 2-3 requests a day to participate in some form of survey. And one reason I almost never do is because I don't believe that there's going to be any connection between what I think and what the behavior of whoever is asking me to respond to a survey.
Mm-hmm.
So where I'm convinced that the input, whatever, whether it's agreed with or not, may actually change the behavior or influence the behavior of the organization, I typically try to engage and be constructive and share as much information as possible. When it's just corporate policy or what have you, it's kind of a don't even waste my time. So part of what I'm suggesting to the chief and to the department is that we should consider the fact that as we try to get the word out that this effort is underway, the collective, we are going to need to do something, I think, also to make sure that the public sees themselves as a partner in this effort, that it's a joint effort to improve the level of services that are being provided. And part of that is going to be an effort to convince people that there is some connection between what they may say in response to this, survey on the one hand, and the operations of the department behavior, on the other. So I don't know how we do that, but I just say that I think we'll be disappointed to find out that many people may not participate if they aren't really convinced that if they don't know the sincerity of your efforts, which I'm convinced of, but I'm saying we need to do more work to make sure the public understands that as well.
So absolutely, Commissioner. I think this is another particular point that LMU is well qualified for in helping us market this outreach and engagement. They are, I think, because of their earlier work and ongoing work with this region, well informed as to even the marketing piece that we had here. If you get a call, take it. Is that they want to see participation. I will look forward to work with them to identify other stakeholders, other community advocacies that can bolster the awareness that this survey is about to launch, and encourage those individuals, those community advocates, to advocate for people's participation. We need to hear from all quarters, and in those that are discouraged or believe because of the association with the department that this may be a survey that lacks certain transparency or authenticity, I look forward, again, working with LMU. How do we work through them and community advocacies to satisfy them as you're challenging the rigors of this? How do we satisfy those advocates in advance so that as we get ready to launch this, they can market on our behalf, actually on behalf of the people of Los Angeles, that this is an important process to begin so that we can regularly and systematically judge ourselves, evaluate how we're doing.
And to just make sure that the message, at least in my view, is not to say to people, hey, we're going out to find out how we're doing. That's a part of it. But what I'm saying is I think, and I think you would agree with this, because you've embraced the notion of continuous improvement. And so it's not simply to find out how we're doing. We're already committed to making sure that we can improve, and this is going to help do that, right? So that's what I'm saying is it's a matter of making sure that people understand we're not simply doing this to find out what the public thinks about LAPD. There's no element of it. No, but even with all we'll learn, I think we already know enough to know that we have room to continue to improve and get better, and this will be an important part of that. So that's the messaging I'm saying. I think we can work together to try to get out as in advance of, or certainly as this is going forward.
Absolutely.
And if I could add one thing, at the end of our LA Public Opinion Survey, we have a line where we explain what the website is if anybody is interested in seeing any of the data, and we tell them when that would be available. We would also be happy to add something at the end of the survey that would explain when we would do presentations if you were interested to the public. So our goal is not that we have this survey that it sits on a shelf and is never used. That's not our mission at all. But we would love to give town hall presentations or just do discussions, we would love to go back to the communities that we did the focus groups and let them know these are the results, the same ones that the commission and the chief and the whole department are hearing. So figuring out additional ways to give back to the community is right up our alley.
I think that's great. And the living, breathing document that it becomes rather than a coaster under
Yes,
somebody's
that's not
table.
our goal at all. Exactly. Although we try to produce pretty work, we actually want
do.
people to pick it up and look through it. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Chair. Thank you.
Any other further questions? Okay, then, I'm sorry, Mr. Teefank, was there something?
I just had one item on the contract that I would bring to the department's attention that has to be corrected. It's on page 6. It is under Roman numeral 8. It's the last two words of that paragraph, city manager. The city manager would not sign off. We don't have a city manager.
Okay.
So it'd be whoever that sign off is, chief of police or whomever it might be.
Thank you for your eagle eyes, Mr. Teefank. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, colleagues, the request is that we approve the department's report. I will move this matter forward. Is there a second? There's a second. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? None. It passes 4-0. Thank you all very much, and thank you for coming in today to present. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, we'll move on to item F, where we'll be hearing department's report on the BOLA WRAP Remote Restrained Device Pilot Program Guidelines. Mr. Teefank, would you mind giving the commission an overview of the process we'll be using today? Since we're not going to be approving the guidelines, but if you could just highlight the process we will be using.
Today you'll be receiving a presentation from the department on the BOLA WRAP and its policy for the guidelines for implementation of it. Those guidelines will be published for 2 weeks for opportunity for public comment, be published on lapdonline.org, and then those comments would come back to the commission. Tentatively, they would be at the February 5th, 2020 commission meeting, and that would be the time when those comments would be vetted by the commission and any other public comment. And at that time, if there were any changes to the guidelines, it would be recommended, and that would be the time the commission will adopt the policy guidelines going forward.
Very good, thank you. If anyone has any questions on the procedure we're following, feel free to ask now. Otherwise, we'll turn to the department for the presentation. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, Chief, Inspector General, Mr. Teefank. I am Deputy Chief Martin Baez. I'm the Commanding Officer of Personnel and Training Bureau. And to my left, your right, is Captain Pete Casey, who's the Commanding Officer of In-Service Training Division. And to my right, your left, is Sergeant Mike Hall, also assigned In-Service Training Division. And with the Commission's indulgence, I'd like to just provide a brief overview of the BOLA WRAP and discuss a little bit of the pilot testing, and then also go into the guidelines which were being presented for you today. The department has always been searching for non-lethal devices that are in alignment with our preservation of life philosophy. And as such, approximately July of 2018, we started to work with WRAP Technologies, who provided a demonstration of the BOLA WRAP. The department began product testing in 2018 as a non-lethal tool to see if it would address our operational needs to complement our preservation of life philosophy, but also not to replace our de-escalation techniques, but to provide tools to our officers for that. In that product testing, WRAP Technologies worked with the department to change the aiming system, to modify the hooks, and to change the coloring of the device itself to match our less lethal munitions. The BOLA is a handheld device with a laser aiming system that propels an 8-foot Kevlar cord, and the cord itself has a strength of 380 pounds. It's got a pull strength. The tether itself propels at a rate of 640 feet per second, and when propelled, the Kevlar cord wraps around the subject's legs. The target intended legs, or the lower abdomen, in which we would be looking at. The cord latch hooks themselves attach themselves to either the clothing of the subject that it's being used on, and if there's no pant leg or clothing, it can puncture the skin and it would latch on to the individual. The desired effect of the BOLA wrap is to limit the movement and remove the subject's ability to flee, limit his or her movement, and assist our officers in taking the subject into custody with minimal risk or minimal harm to themselves, to others, and also to the officers themselves. The minimum deployment distance for the BOLA wrap is 10 feet and a maximum distance of 25 feet. The department is proposing to begin the pilot testing, and we're ready to begin the pilot testing with the guidelines set forth and presented to you for 90 days, with the option of extending it an additional 90 days if we do not receive enough data in the deployment use of the BOLA wrap itself. The pilot consists of deploying 200 devices throughout citywide, including Metropolitan Division, and we have already trained 50 officers per division that will have the devices in order to have an effectiveness of having the device deployed out in the field throughout the clock, in the 24-hour cycle, and that would increase our chances of making sure that we have an adequate deployment and we can assess the information that would be coming to us. In addition to the training that we've already provided our officers, a roll call training video has already been prepared, and it's just going to be tweaked in all candor once the guidelines are approved, so that it could also be rolled out citywide for the officers to, one, be familiarized, the ones that did not get the training, did not have the opportunity to deploy the BOLA wrap, to have a familiarization with it, and two, be familiar with the guidelines that have been established for the pilot testing itself. So in regards to the guidelines have been established for the pilot program for the use, the reporting, and also to define the terminology that the BOLA wrap encompasses. The BOLA wrap, like I mentioned, is a non-lethal option, and the device may be deployed when an individual needing to be detained or controlled has indicated through words or actions that they will resist and will not voluntarily comply with lawful orders, and or the individual has demonstrated an intention to be violent or physically resist, and it reasonably appears that they present a potential harm to themselves, to others, or the officer. We believe that these guidelines will help us in assisting the subject and reducing the injury to the particular individual. The BOLA wrap is not intended for use when a subject is simply fleeing from the officers. It is not intended for that purpose, and the primary target areas are the lower legs between the ankles and the knees. That is our primary target area, and there is a secondary target area, which is the lower abdomen area, when an individual's arm or arms are to their sides, and we try to get the desired effect of trapping one of their arms or both their arms against their body in order to take them into custody. In regards to medical treatment, the BOLA wrap, in our testing process, we've tested it both on a static mannequin, and we've even deployed the BOLA wrap on Assistant Chief Beatrice Grimala and also Chief Moore, and it did not cause any significant injury or penetration of the hooks into the skin. However, if that should happen, the guidelines do provide us the opportunity to seek medical treatment for any individual that has a puncture of the skin. In addition to that, which is very consistent with our current protocols with any use of force, is to monitor the subject for any type of distress in which we would either call a rescue ambulance or seek additional medical assistance with them. In regards to the reporting of the BOLO wrap, what we're looking is to utilize the BOLO, when the BOLO wrap is utilized, it's going to be documented as a non-categorical use of force. And if we do utilize the device and it is deployed and it does not make contact with a subject, we're also going to document that in an employee report to document the effectiveness. Just kind of in the overall view of the pilot, we are looking to assess the data by having the assessment forms, which is attached to your package, submitted to In-Service Training Division along with the arrest reports and also the body-worn video for us to assess its effectiveness to see if it does meet the needs of the department. That, in a brief overview, is what we're looking to accomplish in testing the BOLO wrap in the pilot phase. And I'm available for any questions, should you have any.
Very good. Commissioners, questions? Yep. I have a few, but why don't you start?
Sure. Thank you. Again, you have the draft guidelines there with you. I just wanted to start on the first page. There's the little box that indicates some of the tactical considerations. And one broad question, is this intended, typically when officers are reporting to an incident and there's some tactical planning, along the way, right? Is the idea that this would be part of that for the officers who have this available to them, is the idea that this, or is it expected, I should say, that this would be discussed as part of the tactical planning?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. This is a tool that we're utilizing as part of, it's not to replace any de-escalation. We encourage us to continue our de-escalation techniques. However, in the utilization of moving it into a non-categorical use of force, this has to be part of the planning process. Because it limits the subject's mobility, we have to have a plan in order how we're going to take the subject into custody. The approach and actually put hands on the person that this device has been deployed on. So we have been training our officers not only how to utilize it, but also as a part of the planning of the utilization and then how we're going to approach the suspect upon its use.
Okay, and it's my understanding that there's a small handful of other departments that are also trying this out. And does what we're looking at here, does that capture, I don't know if you've had any consultation with any of the other agencies that are looking at it, but that's the question is, are we trying to get the best of best, or?
We're trying to get the best of the best, absolutely. And the agencies that have actually deployed it have deployed one or two. We are absolutely the largest agency that's going to have the most devices deployed, in the number 200, in order to get the most data. So even though other agencies throughout the nation have deployed, the BOLO wrap, the numbers are quite smaller than what we anticipate.
Part of what I'm asking is because it sounds a little bit like maybe some may have just deployed it, but I'm asking, does anyone have any guidelines? So you're going to the step of publishing some guidelines that are going to put some parameters around this. And so I'm trying to get an idea, is there somebody else that's got the A-list guidelines already there that you've consulted, or are you going to end up writing a little bit of the playbook?
We're the ones that are writing the playbooks. Basically, after speaking to the manufacturer and speaking to the subject matter experts in the BOLA and in wrap technologies, a lot of agencies have just deployed them and incorporated them into their use of force.
Okay.
We are taking the added steps of we're being the first law enforcement agency that is piloting, testing it, and also writing guidelines for them.
Okay, and one broad question that I have about this, just the idea of having this deployed in some serious situation, is it going to be clear, or can it be made more clear that just in simple terms, you can't have this device wrapped around somebody and then use additional force, or what are the circumstances where somebody can have this wrapped around their arms and their ab, and somebody's beating them up or using additional force once the device is deployed? What are the considerations, or what will be the training around that?
Well, the training is consistent with our use of force policy. Once the force that we are using, we still take it into consideration whether the force is reasonable. We are not going to deviate from our use of force policy. This is just an added tool for us to be able to take a person into custody. And we will hold our officers accountable if we see that occurs very consistent with our procedures and protocols. We are not deviating from our use of force policy.
Let me ask you, but I assume, even though it should be, one would assume it's somewhat common sense, but I assume something somewhere tells an officer that, for example, if you've got somebody in handcuffs, right? That, and now I know there may be circumstances, somebody still can be using their head, their feet, what have you. So there's always going to be that case-by-case determination whether additional force is required. But as a general proposition, isn't there something that says to officers that, once someone is essentially in custody, or at least subdued, that there's some limitation on your ability to continue to use force at that point?
Yes, that's our use of force policy. And that's what we are consistently training with the use of any tool, that once the subject is no longer a threat, that any use of force shall
and that's what I'm asking you to consider in this. I don't want to have to write up a public comment, but I will if I have to. But I'm asking you to consider adding to these guidelines something that makes it very clear that once, if the device is successfully deployed, that however it's treated relative to somebody being in handcuffs or in some other similar situation. I'm just saying I think it'd be helpful to make, because the concern on behalf of the public, at least as I've heard it, generally speaking, is, as you can imagine, there's some concern about misuse, overuse, what have you, and that is kind of the idea that someone's going to be wrapped into this and then still subject to further harm. So I'd say consider
absolutely,
making it
we
clear
can make
if you
that consideration. Absolutely.
In terms of I know the preference is to have it deployed against the area between the knee and the ankle, or the lower abdomen, as you described. What, if anything, do we know about the impact if something is, one of these does get wrapped around someone's face or their neck or something like that? What is the manufacturer's evidence, or whatever testing we've done? But what do we know about the risk in that situation?
Do we have information?
Good afternoon. The greatest risk actually is going to be from the hooks that'll be traveling around the face and then potentially puncturing an eye. So the wrap itself around the neck does not restrict, and so therefore there's not a lack of airflow or anything like that. So we're very specific in our training that we do not aim for that area. The lowest or highest area on the body, the secondary aiming point, is actually between the wrists and the elbows, when one or both arms are down by the side, so that we avoid that potential. As far as testing, we've deployed it on mannequins, and obviously, but the biggest risk is those hooks potentially puncturing a sensitive area.
And if I understood you saying that you're satisfied that if it gets wrapped around someone's neck, it's not going to choke them,
Correct.
out. But if it did hit an eye, it could take an eye out or something along those lines. And how does this work in terms of, because no one's really very familiar with the device, but if the officer's trained in marksmanship and the like, so we kind of know how effective someone is and how accurate they are in hitting a target. How does that work with a device like this? Are you able, before the officer's able to deploy it, are they certified in some way to know that how effective they are in hitting their target?
Yes, we actually worked with the manufacturer on developing. It used to be a laser dot, and we developed a laser line, which assisted the officers to be able to clearly see where on the target they're deploying the unit, but also to make sure that it's aimed correctly, that it's parallel with the ground, so that we get that effective wrap. From all of our testing internally, and then from all of our training that we've done, we've never had an issue as far as a point of aim, point of impact, meaning that where you put that laser line, we are getting that impact in that general area. There's no recoil with the device, unlike our firearms. So therefore, from our training, what we do is we have each operator, each student has to deploy two different cartridges and stuff. We have instructors, because it's a one-on-one thing when they are deploying it, making sure that they are hitting the areas that are recommended, and then providing any additional remedial training on the spot if they're hitting outside of those areas.
And in some of the other training that we've seen, there's an officer, supervising officer, or someone who is directing the deployment of the .40 caliber or the beanbag? Or is this similar thing where someone's going to direct, so the officer that's got the device is only going to use it when somebody is directing it?
Well, that is that's on a case-by-case basis. However, in a circumstance like this with this type of device, we are looking to use it as part of a command and control situation where less lethal is deployed, lethal is deployed, and then in this case, non-lethal is deployed. Because one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to limit the resistance of the subject. So we are going to need additional officers to put hands on the subjects. So it's not going to be a circumstance, and we don't foresee it to be a circumstance where it's going to be a one-on-one where the officer is going to deploy it and try to take somebody into custody. A lot of our training goes into not only the deployment of it, but also the planning of taking the subject into custody after the deployment and after the restriction of the movement of the subject.
So I understood all that, but I'm still a little bit unclear in terms of, is the officer that has the device, they're making the determination in that instance as to whether to deploy it, or is someone saying, bolo wrap, and then they're...
Yeah, like many of our other less lethal options, yes, it's up that the officer does have that option to deploy it, and then we also have the option of using it within the command and control structure. So the utilization of this tool does not deviate from our already established protocols when it comes to our use of force policy. I know I said that before, but one of the things we were trying to do, and one of the things that we also want to iron out in our pilot, is to make sure that all these issues are satisfied, that we are satisfied that it meets the needs, and then we can make adjustments. And we don't know what the end result of the pilot. We are this looks very promising to us as a non-lethal tool that will reduce injury. So we're hopeful that the results are as we anticipate and as we've seen in our product testing. But we won't have the entire picture until it's actually deployed out in the field.
And so my final question is, who and how are you determining which officers actually get to participate in the pilot?
What we did is we had each division send 50 officers, 50 officers that are actually assigned field duty operations. They're working black and whites, and then we also had 50 officers from the Metropolitan Division. We left it up to the commanding officers to send us officers that are full duty, that are out in marked black and whites handling radio calls, in order to get an effectiveness sample of interaction with the radio calls and the community. So that's how the officers were selected.
And that's going to remain studied during the pilot programming? There won't be officers coming in and...
No, yeah, correct. Correct. Officers will be trained in regards to roll call training, in regards to the familiarization of it. But the 50 officers, that's the reason that we went with such a large number with, approximately 10 devices at each division. We went with a large number so that we would have a larger demographic and more officers deployed throughout all the watches that can check out the device in order to do that. After the pilot program, it's a 90-day pilot program with the option to extend it if we don't have enough data. Then the rollout for the rest of the department would be implemented for the actual utilization of it, which is very consistent what we did with the beanbag, and then a few years ago with the 40 millimeter as we rolled out the pilots for that.
Thank you. I think this is my last one, is relative to the evaluation, the form. Are we going to capture data information that tells us that not only helps us understand like circumstances in which the device is used,
Yes.
but also we had a conversation earlier today about the RIPA data, for example, where we'll be able to understand the demographics of the individuals who are part of this pilot, on the other end of this pilot, if you will. In other words, are we going to capture any of that kind of data?
Yeah. Currently, during the pilot program, we're not capturing demographics in regards to race, but we are capturing age and circumstances of the deployment.
But we can. We certainly, because there is a non-categorical use of force investigation that captures that data now, that coexists with this form that you have here. And we can ask that in our evaluation, we understand the characteristics of the individuals to include circumstances of the encounter, but race, ethnicity, age, those are factors that we can.
I'd encourage you to find some appropriate way to do that. Thank you.
Great. I only have a few quick questions, the benefit of going second, I suppose. You had said that if not enough data is collected, you'd want to obviously have a 90-day extension, but do you have a sense now of how many cases that you're looking for? Is this going to be anecdotal as you evaluate the cases as they're coming in on use?
Right now, we would like to actually see approximately, within 90 days, we'd like to have a sample that we can analyze. We haven't put an actual number on it, but I want to see enough deployment, which for me would be anywhere within the range of 30 to 50, to be able to determine its effectiveness. I think that would give us a little bit of a better idea in regards to what we're seeing in regards to its objective of non-injury, the effectiveness of the limited mobility. And also what type of injury, if any, are we getting in regards to the deployment. So I think that would give us a relatively good sample in regards to it. If we only have 2 deployments in the 90-day period, which is possible, we would like to extend it a little further because that would not give us enough information to really make a valuable determination as to how we should move forward with this particular device.
And you may have just answered my second question, which was, what's the sort of data you're going to be looking for to determine if it's effective in the field? And is that what you just summarized? Whether there's injury, whether it effectively de-escalates a situation?
Correct. The effectiveness, whether it de-escalates the situation, injury rate, and if it also minimizes, the situation, if it de-escalates the situation. We are looking at all that data in regards to its effectiveness overall.
And as a result, might you, at the end of that 90-day period, then be recommending additional changes to the guidelines on where it is most effective in the field? Is that also one of your objectives?
That is correct. And I think one of the reasons that we wanted to have guidelines for this pilot program was in order to, like I said, give the officers the boundaries of its utilization. So that we can also evaluate whether we need to make changes to tighten them up, to make the appropriate adjustments that we see in the field. Right now, we don't know what we don't know because we haven't utilized it out in other than in a static controlled environment. So I think once we get enough information, we'll be able to make additional changes and then formalize the pilot guidelines to be actual guidelines in order to utilize it, similar to what we have with the taser, the beanbag, and also the 40 millimeter, so that we have established guidelines and protocols.
Thank you.
And commissioners, we would
2 questions.
I'm sorry,
Chief, go.
But as a department, while we're recommending a 90-day view, the reality is that given the level of interest and characteristics in which this device is being evaluated, we have great expectations that this is going to be a successful tool, but it is just a tool. I do worry, last year we had about 2,200 total citywide non-categorical uses of force through 1.7, 1.8 million encounters. There is a narrow set of circumstances in which this tool is applicable. I don't know that we'll see 30 or 50 encounters, and I would ask for your indulgence is that perhaps in 90 days we could come back with an initial report and afford us the continuity of continuing this for a 6-month or 1-year pilot, obviously subject to cease should there be any negative, unintended, or unanticipated consequences. But I do believe that the criticality of this is getting confidence in the field force to believe that this is a tool that is that has some relevance. It's not something out of some space science fiction matter, and that officers in serious situations can rely upon it to be effective and give them a standoff capability. So, modifying this in process here, extending this time period with regular updates to this commission would allow us to keep continuity. And at a certain term, certainly, shutting something down is relatively simple. Stop using it, pull the devices off the market, pull the devices out of the field. But I worry about it, are we on or off at a 90-day report, which then takes time in which for us to get a report to you? Are we in a holding period, that period of time, and then officers are told to get back on the device, and it's just inconsistent.
Understood. And just let me ask the city attorney if we can, given that this draft pilot program guidelines were presented to the public, can we make that revision here to have it 180 days with a 90-day report? Is that acceptable? Since we're going to post this for public comment and vote on it in early February.
Right. You can go ahead and make the amendment now as long as whatever you post for the future meeting includes the changes you're making today.
Understood. Okay.
What's the effective range again?
The effective range is the minimum effective range is 10 feet, the minimum 10 feet, maximum 25.
25 feet maximum. And what is the velocity, did you say, per?
Yes,
The velocity, muzzle velocity is actually 513 feet at muzzle, and that's
513 feet per what?
Feet per second. And then at 10 feet, it's at 270 feet per second.
Okay, that thing's coming out 300 miles an hour. It's coming out fast.
It is coming out fast.
Okay. My question, I think the chief answered most of it, but are there situations that we look at now, they say, boy, we wish we would have had this in this case and that case? I mean, I think of the shooting that happened in the mall, where that just, in Crenshaw Mall. I think of some of these knife situations. But on the other hand, with a knife situation, many times we don't deploy anything until the person's like this. So are there situations that this is just made to order for? Can you describe any of those now, or you want to wait?
Well, absolutely. I think this is a tool that it's not going to be applicable in every circumstance.
Sure.
In every circumstance, just like you say, if somebody's charging you with a knife, in the motion that you had, it's probably not the best tool in order to do it. But if you do have somebody with a knife who is in a static position, who is obviously verbalizing his intent not to follow, it could be absolutely utilized. I think it would be. I think it would be difficult for me to say, I wish we would have had this in all these circumstances, because each one presents their own unique set of circumstances. Sure. However, there are situations that we are looking to test this product to see if it's going to be a viable product in certain circumstances. Like I said, maybe somebody with a knife, maybe somebody who is not armed but is under the influence, who is very difficult to approach, but has already expressed an intent of violence, and we're able to restrict his movements or her movements in order to take them into custody in a rapid way without adding risk of injury to them or them running out into the community and providing risks for somebody else.
If somebody turns and runs away and it was a threat or still has a threat, it seemed to me like that's a good potential use versus some of the alternatives.
Yeah, but it's not designed to. If an officer goes in foot pursuit with somebody, we're not recommending it that
I
it be
agree
used.
with
That it be used in that circumstance.
Yeah.
But we would like to utilize it in that window before they have
Yes.
that opportunity
Yes.
to go into a flight situation where we can restrict their movements by wrapping their legs.
Good. Okay. Very helpful. Thank you.
Unless there are other questions and comments, seeing none, then based upon the advice from our executive director, I'll direct that the amendment be made and that we post it online as indicated earlier.
And Commissioner, just for the public's information, what we will do is we'll create an email address. I'm thinking right now, BOLORAP_guidelines@lapd.online. Do a press release, post it on the front page of the website, have it out for 2 weeks for the comments. We'll create a proxy to get those comments, most likely training division, and have it come back.
That's good.
Thank you. And if we could also have copies of that made available at the next two board meetings
Absolutely.
for members of the public so they can
Sure.
see. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We're up to item H then, the audit report.
We don't, do we have to vote on that?
I'm told that.
Say it again?
Right?
We have to take an action. Yeah, okay. So we do.
Attorney, we do have to vote? I'm sorry. Can you clarify?
Okay, you have to take an action to direct exactly what you just.
Okay, so then I'll move that forward. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Aye. All opposed? Thank you for that. I'm just, in the interest of time, I'm conferring with my colleagues about questions they may have. I trust that everyone read the audit, understands it, and perhaps unless you object and feel desperately you want to make your presentation, I will just ask for questions from my colleagues.
Ma'am, I'm sure everybody wants to hear from me, but no, I don't object.
I do have just a few questions. I'll just say my comment and then question. I was a little, I guess, surprised that the audit didn't turn out as well as I would have expected, given the importance of the positions being reviewed for, and that what we're really talking about is more administrative functions here. And Commander, if I could address a question to you, particularly on your response to the audit. And I'll say that I wasn't necessarily pleased with the response because everyone in government will complain about resources, which is a fair complaint to have, but all of our jobs are dependent on figuring the problem out and complying with our own guidelines and policies, which really don't appear to be too onerous. And so I'd like to hear from you, sir, about your plan moving forward on how you're going to improve the results for the future, because these are critically important positions. It strikes me that this is a largely administrative function, that the guidelines are in place for a reason, because it's important to have every file in order as individuals are being moved into these various divisions. So if you wouldn't mind, Commander, addressing that.
So first of all, on the the TERs, the 27 individuals, employees that were selected were all internal. So what we discovered in the review of the audit and working with all of the various commands, that when you have a selection, say for instance, we're talking about FTO, field training officer selections, there's a position called a testing coordinator that is supposed to work directly with employee selection, employee services selection. So they are the SMEs, they are the holders of questions, task lists, etc., for all of these examinations per se. In this case, what we identified is the testing coordinator during 2018 changed rapidly. A testing coordinator can be identified as an area adjutant, a secretary. Now, when you have a selection, and say, for example, in the FTOs, there's 10 items in the selection package that have to be reviewed that contain numerous documents. So when you have a test coordinator that is looking at this, it was done sloppy, so first of all, so we own that. So what we've recommended is putting out a notice to all OO employees, talking to the bureau chiefs and bureau commands and captains, et cetera, of placing the importance on what that test coordinator position is. So we're recommending that the testing coordinator work directly with employee selection. What we also identified is with the field training officers is that you can test for field training officer numerous times through various months, because their positions come available a lot. So what we identified is the various cross-mixing of selection packages with checklists and TERs and the documentation. So we're putting a stop to that. We've asked employee selection to work with the testing coordinator, and when we have an FTO, for instance, become available, that full package is sent directly to the testing coordinator, who then has the due responsibility to accept the package, the full 10 items, to review the package along with the area commanding officer and ensure that all the documents are completed appropriately. We feel that's a big step in this process. And then, since we do have a lot of turnover in the administrative offices, is to ask our captains that when they do have an upcoming interview, say, coming up, is to select a testing coordinator that has the ability to manage and to be able to accept the responsibility and what this is during the testing process of understanding that they have full responsibility in going through the whole package and ensuring that it's completed properly. But it doesn't negate the responsibility for the area command to go over this, because they're signing the final checklist, that all the documents are there. So that's step 2, and then working with ESS to provide the training to the testing coordinator of duties and responsibilities. And then the last thing is the notice that is going to be put out. I think that in general, and placing the importance of not allowing sloppy work and things to be submitted, at the conclusion of these exams.
I appreciate that response, Commander, very much. I don't want to drone on about this issue, but I do feel this audit highlighted some problems. These are very important divisions that people are being assigned to. At the very least, we should be able to be assured that administratively, all the appropriate documents have been collected and reviewed as these individuals are being evaluated. I would ask, I'm not asking for a report back to the full commission, but I do think the executive committee on the commission should get an update on the progress being made. Shall we say 6 months? Is that a fair timetable to allow you time to execute much of these efforts and to report back to the executive committee, which is the president and vice president of the commission? And should we see an issue, members of the commission will ask be brought back to the full commission if everybody's just agreeable on that. Okay.
So, ma'am, we had one. The office had have our own internal audit for the first quarter of this year, based on this, so I can report back sooner.
That would be that sounds logical, given that you will have already done your own internal review.
Okay. Yeah.
And I do appreciate that, Commander. Any other questions? Seeing nothing, then the request is, and I'll move that we approve the department's report. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Seeing none, it passes 4-0. Thank you all very much. I appreciate that. Seeing how we already had the chief's report, closed session items, is there a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
So moved. Seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Yes. We stand adjourned until our next meeting. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.